The Fate of Austria. This video is purely for entertainment and does not infringe on copyrights or laws. The rights to the novel and image belong to the original author. We do not claim ownership. Don't like waiting and want to listen to this fanfic in full now? Subscribe to our Patreon, where you'll find the best fanfics. Chapter 251. The horse bandits must be eliminated. Hungary. A group of cavalry coming from the direction of Graz attracted special attention. The sharp eyes found that the mounts of these knights were not the local bad-tempered mixed breed horses, but a kind of docile and quiet horses, but it can be easily identified from its powerful hind legs, strong back and waist, that this is a kind of warhorse. Yes, the Holstein horse is one of the best warhorse breeds in the 19th century, with both explosive power and endurance. It's just that this thing can't tolerate rough feeding. If you want it to run, you need to feed it black beans and rapeseed oil. The food treatment is simply better than that of ordinary citizens. Albrecht looked at the well-equipped troops behind him and couldn't help but sigh. If only those weapons hadn't been invented. 3 days later, a royal estate on the Hungarian plains. Attila is a retired cavalry colonel. To be honest, he never thought that a group of serfs could be so difficult to deal with. Although he had served for 20 years, Attila had never participated in a battle. He thought it would be quite pleasant to lead a group of young people with revolvers to kill a few serfs, but he soon discovered that you will have to pay the price for your wrong judgment. Many people had previously described this as a simple hunting, and at that time he believed it was true. It's just that who would have thought that he would lose more than a dozen people in one fight just now, which made him want to cry without tears, for fear that he would not be able to communicate with the superiors. Attila's men originally numbered 100 men, all of them young and vigorous men, each of whom was equipped with 2 revolvers and a saber. The first 2 attacks were successful, but the third failed. I wonder where those German immigrants got their rifles, he thought to himself. The results of the revolver and rifle shooting can be imagined. Fortunately, the skills of both sides were very poor and did not cause a large number of casualties. Attila brought 2 cavalry cannons this time. He thought it would be more enjoyable to chase down those headless flies that were running around. The caliber of the cavalry cannon is very small, but it is enough to deal with those simple wooden fences. A few rounds of shells shattered the wooden fence. Just as a few young people were talking and laughing and preparing to continue shooting, several figures suddenly appeared behind the fence, aiming here with rifles. Attila couldn't help laughing when he saw the scene in front of him. Let alone a group of serfs, even trained soldiers would have no hope of hitting their target 200 meters away. However, his smile froze in the next second, and several bullets accurately hit the people near his cavalry cannon. After penetrating the human body, a cloud of blood mist emerged. Seeing their companions fall, the other horse bandits immediately took out their revolvers and started to fight back. Everyone used up all the bullets in their guns. Several farmers 200 meters away were changing bullets very calmly. Soon the second round of bullets came, and several more horse bandits fell. It was then that Attila suddenly realized, it's a rifled gun. Idiot, don't shoot at them. Get on your horse and overwhelm them. Hurry. This group of young Magyar nobles were very courageous. They immediately climbed onto their horses, put their feet under the horse's belly, and rushed towards the wooden fence. In a church not far away, Albrecht was observing the situation on the battlefield with a telescope. He couldn't help but sigh when he saw this. They're here to die. Just before the hot-blooded horse bandits were about to rush into the manor, a caravan blocked the door. It was obvious that the war horses could not cross the caravan, and it was impossible to rush over. There were only 2 options before them now, either to turn around and go back, or to dismount and fight on foot. If you choose the former, you will inevitably become the target of the sharpshooters on the wall. If you turn around, if you choose the latter, there will be no difference in the result. Just when they were in a dilemma, the light cavalry who had already been ambushed on the flank rushed out. But all this could only be seen by Attila, who was sitting at the back. He was suddenly horrified and screamed secretly. The chaos ahead continued, and Attila's shouts were difficult to distinguish among the battlefield of gunfire. When the horse bandits finally realized that they were ambushed, the distance between the 2 sides was less than 100 meters. This only takes a few seconds for the warhorse point since ancient times. The result of cavalry battles has always been that before the two sides come into contact, one side cannot withstand the pressure and directly collapses, and then is chased by the other side. Point this time, the horse bandits played the latter role. As hunters, they became the prey being hunted. What's worse is that most of the horse bandits have not received formal cavalry training. Most of them are just hot-blooded single-clothed nobles and young people. When these former hunters discovered that the knights of Franz's dragoons were charging towards them, their minds were still thinking about while only serfs had cavalry. The light cavalry of the dragoon regiment used lances. Lancers, a unit that should have disappeared from history, can only be seen in Austria and the perished Poland. However, the reason why the lancers were eliminated was not because their impact was weak, or because they were a weak threat to the cavalry. In fact, the lancers are the most powerful force in this era. Under the leadership of a skilled commander, they can cause effective damage, whether facing an infantry queue or a cavalry group. But this unit has a fatal flaw, which is that it requires a lot of time to undergo complex training. For example, the famous French cuirassiers have to go through the test of passing 5 levels. The Scottish Grey Cavalry has 7 trainings, and the Prussian Skeleton Cavalry is divided into 9 trainings. However, the Polish Lancers have to undergo 55 different types of training, 22 for cavalry, 18 for infantry, and 15 for basic training alone. At the same time, the Austrian Lancers also needed to undergo 37 types of training to become a qualified Lancer. A qualified Polish gun rider usually requires 5 years or more of training, and some of them are unable to master this 55 skill throughout their lives. Historically, the Poles have been particularly fond of the elite route, so the consequences are that when they are brilliant, the Hussars are alone in suppressing the show. But when they are miserable, they are a stepping stone for Europe. The training of Austrian Lancers usually takes 3 years, while the Prussian Skeleton Cavalry only takes 1 year. The Scottish Grey Cavalry can be discharged in 6 months, and the French cuirassiers in the Napoleonic period only need 3 months from enlistment to burial. But this is very suitable for Franz's dragoon regiment, because they have studied combat all their lives closer to home. The horse bandits, who had lost their mobility advantage and fighting opportunity, were stabbed to the core by the opponent's spear before they even had time to struggle. In just a few dozen seconds, the battlefield that was noisy just now became quiet. Due to Archduke Albrecht's order to only kill the enemy and not pursue it, the cavalry that completed the defensive task retreated and did not charge towards Itama, which was 200 meters away. Let's run, Master Itama. The old servant grew up with Itama, and he had seen the world. Since he joined the army with his master, not only did he know the power of the cavalry in front of him, but he also understood that those hiding behind the walls were not serfs, but sharps. If he did not retreat, he might be responsible for this. Note, the elite skirmishers at that time were called sharpshooters. Austria only had 1 sharpshooter regiment in Tyrol. Ballas, I can't move my legs, help me. Only then did the old servant realize that Mr. Itama's pants were already wet. Obviously, the killing just left an overly shocking impression on him. In fact, it is not his fault. A person who has never actually participated in a war has witnessed more than 60 fresh lives disappearing without any trouble. It's hard to stay sane right now. As soon as Ballas helped Itama onto his horse, a bullet penetrated his head. At the same time, several young men who tried to successfully take away the cavalry artillery also suffered the same fate. It was obvious that the sharpshooters behind the wall wanted to leave some trophies, seeing their companions being easily shot and killed like prey right in front of them. The morale of the remaining horse bandits was completely shattered. They were like frightened antelopes when being chased by a lion, screaming and fleeing impatiently. Hunting grounds, seeing the enemies fleeing in panic, the sharpshooters disguised as serfs in the royal manner, raised their glasses one after another. Cheer, friends. We have won. At this time, the German immigrants and Hungarian refugees who had been bullied before all cried with joy. These suffering people finally no longer had to worry and be afraid. This was their time to vent to their heart's content, and the enemy could no longer hinder them. At night, people piled the dead bandits and horses together, put them on logs and lit a bonfire. A bonfire party just started. Albrecht did not agree with this behavior, but he would not be too harsh on his subordinates. Albrecht divided the team into 3 groups who took turns to be responsible for the night's security work. The remaining people were free to rest or party if they wanted, but they were not allowed to nap while on duty point. But as the saying goes, there are policies from above and countermeasures from below. As soon as Albrecht's order was announced, people below him started to have other ideas. The Grand Duke was very strict in running the army, not to mention that it would be very rude to doze off in front of the royal family point. So they decided to select a group of unlucky people to keep vigil, while the rest partied all night long. Albrecht did not follow Franz's advice to unite his troops, but divided them into 6 parts to take charge of the defense. Of the 6 estates, Franz was of course afraid that something would happen to him, while Albrecht felt that it would be too inefficient. Judging from battle reports from other areas and my own observations, there is no doubt that the so-called horse bandits who have plagued the Great Plains for hundreds of years are a completely ragtag group of people. At this time, several daring girls came over to him. Albrecht's first reaction was to call the guard. As a result, he found that the guard was staring at them with squinting eyes, so he had to kick him hard on the butt. "Idiot, sir, why don't you celebrate? This is just a tactical victory and not worthy of celebration, sir. You have been busy all night. Today may not be anything for you, but for us, it is indeed more worthy of celebration than a holiday. Have a drink and relax," one of the sweet-looking and generous girls said. After thinking about it for a while, Albrecht seemed to be right. He was often said to be unkind, and decided to change his mind. He took the wine glass and drank it down in one gulp. "Ladies, you can leave now, thanks." To Soda Burden Book Friends 20220713150139369 for the reward. Chapter 250 To the Iron Triangle of Asia, Europe, and Africa. As Franz expected, no big noble would support such a foolish move. Similarly, ordinary people have not reached the point where they cannot survive, and they do not want to participate in such an action that is doomed to fail from the beginning. The future described by Kossuth, in which every Magyar can live on an equal footing, obviously cannot move other ethnic groups in Hungary, and even those foreign ethnic groups should have been expelled and enslaved. The so-called Hun Legion did not have the record of their ancestors, and it was difficult to take advantage even when facing untrained German immigrants. When facing the dragoons led by Albrecht, they were defeated in a row and were beaten everywhere without the strength to fight. These people are not good at fighting, but they are quite good at wreaking havoc. Hun is the whip of God. How can it be done without killing some people? Some experts even put forward the idea of cultivating murderous energy. Then the Hungarian peasants and serfs living in the countryside suffered, but the Huns who did such things had no sense of guilt at all. Most of them did not think that they were of the same race as those serfs. Kossuth was also of noble origin, and his main supporters were also single-clothed nobles and urban nobles. As for the life and death of those serfs, since he did not participate in the massacre, he naturally had no knowledge. Although Kossuth was elevated to the same level as Mandela and Gandhi in later history, as one of Hungary's supreme rulers, he participated in and planned countless massacres against ethnic minorities. Angel of Hungary Kossuth, Light of Africa Mandela, and Mahatma Gandhi were once promoted by the United States as the 3 greatest nationalists in human history. The glorious deeds of this group of people, Mahatma Gandhi, as the founding father of India and the founder of non-violent non-cooperation, was shot by Hindus during the partition of India and Pakistan. Light of Africa Mandela, tears behind bars, I resigned looks like Washington, after death floods, Black Lives Matter, Mandela effect Hungarian. Angel Kossuth, the purification agreement is signed. I ran away, but not completely. A contract worth 3 million francs, about the fact that he boasted about American freedom, and ended up causing discomfort to abolitionists, and being sprayed all over him. The tutor commented sharply, he is not innocent. Moreover, due to the impact of the Reichstag fire, the power of Hungary's rural aristocracy has been severely weakened, and the few brave men are a joke in front of the regular army. The dragoon regiment that Franz lent to Albrecht was not useless. Everyone knew that they were the future emperor's personal soldiers, and in the future they could at least work in the forbidden army. If you are lucky and become a colonel, you will become a local tyrant, and you can become a general or marshal without any upper limit. But if he becomes a deserter, even if the Grand Duke and the military law society let him go, his family will not allow such a big stain to remain in the world. Archduke Karol also sent his own guards to Hungary. Although father and son were at odds, it was impossible to say that an old father of an ancient family was not worried about his eldest son. Although this guard looks similar to the guards of other royal princes, it is actually composed of veterans who have experienced many battles, and there are even many retired officers. In fact, the size of the entire Austrian Empire's private guard rarely exceeds 200. The Grand Duke of Tuscany's guard only has 200 people, and Archduke Karol's guard has a total of 2,000 people. However, it does not exceed the limit, because the Austrian Empire has strict regulations on noble private soldiers. There is no limit on the number of guards. After half a month of fighting, more than 10,000 horse bandits were killed and captured. Faced with such two monster legions, the Magyars are not fools. They look for soft persimmons if they can't chew the hard bones. There are also many horse bandits raised by the nobles who are also fishing in troubled waters. All promotion of Magyarism has now become a tool for profit. The internal fighting among the horse bandits made Franz very happy, and he was eager to use this to continue to weaken Hungary's strength. But Albrecht couldn't sit still. He was a general who advocated offense, and training militiamen was not his specialty, let alone what he wanted. Albrecht's initiative took everyone by surprise. Experienced scouts first went to check on the spot, tracked and locked the target, and then a large group of people arrived to launch a surprise attack. This new type of rodless spin rocket is much more convenient than the previous model, and can be carried directly by soldiers without the need for a carriage. This is simply a doomsday scene for those horse bandits who want to resist in their own manners. Countless rockets flew into the houses in the manor from all directions, and the wooden buildings quickly caught fire. At first, some people tried to put out the fire, but soon they discovered that this was no ordinary fire. Those who tried to put out the fire all turned into firemen. The firemen ran through the house, igniting more flammable materials, and the constant explosions were destroying the building structure of the house. Occasionally, some firemen tried to escape from the house, but they were quickly killed by soldiers outside. When the local serfs discovered that the attackers seemed to have no ill intentions towards them, they gathered around to watch the grand fireworks. At this time, someone will explain to the Hungarian serfs in the local language that the people in the house colluded with the horse bandits to kill civilians and passing business travelers. They were all guys like Countess Bathory with human faces and animal hearts. The story of Countess Bathory, the famous Hungarian vampire countess, was widely circulated due to previous attempts by some Magyar nationalists to portray her as a national hero in Hungary. It's just that anyone with a normal mind would not think of her as a national hero, but as an out-and-out vampire countess. Traditionally speaking, the only two vampires in European history should be Gilles de Rais, a French marshal during the 100 Years' War and a follower of Joan of Arc, and Countess Elizabeth Bathory of Hungary. However, both countries refused to admit their fault. Later, a novel in 1897 described Romania's national hero, the famous Impaler, as the ancestor of vampires. Since then, with the continuous fermentation of novels and movies, people have finally forgotten this period of history, but the only vampire in Eastern Europe in this era was Countess Bathory. The serfs immediately understood this, and they all talked freely about how weird, cruel, and often blasphemous the nobles and the people around them were. Soon, the soldiers became very angry after hearing the local people's exaggerated remarks, which further confirmed the justice of their actions at this time. The evil vampires have been eliminated, and all that's left to do is divide the spoils. But since a fire burned down the house, the soldiers didn't know what else to loot. These people really looked down on those wheat, flour, farm tools, etc. He wanted to snatch a girl, but the Grand Duke was following him, so he simply announced that everything would be divided among the serfs. Chapter 253. The storm subsides. As we all know, in any era, the favorite thing of farmers is to divide the land from local tyrants. The reason why so many serfs had uncontrollable expressions of excitement on their faces when they saw the house burning with fire was not because of their cruel and ruthless nature, but because of the shackles on their bodies, the contract of prostitution. The fire disappeared. They naively thought that, as long as the bond of sale was burned, they would be free from the shackles of their current status. In fact, the nobles had already registered their status as serfs. Even if the deed of sale was lost, they could go to the Hungarian government to get 1 point. In other words, unless the serfs and the noble lord go to the government for notarization together, even if the noble lord dies and the deed of sale is lost, they will still be the property of the noble. But this short-term freedom and sweet dream still made the serfs intoxicated. The horse bandits suffered repeated setbacks, and the Austrian Empire began to gradually exert pressure, which put Kossuth's position in danger. At this time, some pro-Austrian nobles jumped out and called for an end to terrorist actions and cooperation with the empire to develop the economy, such as building a railway from Vienna to Budapest, which would provide more jobs for Hungarians. As for serfdom, it was the lifeblood of small and medium-sized nobles. Of course no one will mention at point it was impossible to build the railway, but no one wanted to continue building it. Someone once suggested that the Royal Dragon Knights and Archduke Karol's guard should be eliminated to avenge the young people who died. It's just that person was sprayed all over his body on the spot. Let's not talk about how difficult it is to defeat these two troops. Simply annihilating them would be equivalent to declaring war with the Austrian aristocracy. No one is really stupid enough to think that the Habsburg royal family can rule Hungary only by an agreement. Moreover, the Neletanian nobles, who are also full of martial virtue, are by no means easy to mess with. Most of them are military nobles. Generations have had long and rich war experience, especially when fighting civil wars. Although the Austrian nobles often colluded with the French and Prussians, they never compromised with the Hungarians. It was the royal family and the government that compromised Hungary. Since the time of Queen Nisa, the military has always had plans to unify Hungary by force, such as the famous Plan U, Y. Plan U instead of Plans A, B, C, D, E, and F. It's been planned for a long time, and it's over. The pressure from the nobles and the government was okay. What really caused the Hun Legion to be temporarily disbanded was Albrecht's proactive strategy. Under normal circumstances, it is illegal to execute someone without approval, but given that the other party has the huge bonus of royal status, and there are a large number of serfs as witnesses every time, it cannot be inferred. Based on common sense, it would be fine if the charge was just that of raising private soldiers without reporting the matter. But there was no way to clean up such things as allowing slaves to plunder and attacking merchants on the vast Hungarian plains. There is nothing more terrifying than cavalry. They come and go like the wind and can travel hundreds of kilometers a day. Unless they were hiding in the city, no family's mansion could block a regiment-sized cavalry raid. In fact, it is common for Hungarian nobles to have dozens or hundreds of thugs in their homes, and many manors of forts. A wubeo is a small castle made of accumulated bricks and stones. It can resist bandits and bandits. It has food and water sources inside, and can even protect itself in low-intensity wars. But in the 19th century, let alone this kind of dock, even a standard castle like the Bastille could not withstand artillery bombardment. However, when performing an attack mission, the commander usually does not require the riders to carry such heavy weapons in order not to affect the speed of travel. This also caused some of the enemy's enemies to feel confident in the early stage. Cavalry artillery is not the same as cavalry. Some people must say that cavalry does not always run when it is forced to march, but cavalry artillery still has weight, no matter how light it is. However, judging from the experience of fighting during this period, there is no doubt that Archduke Albrecht has a way to crack the shell of wubeo. Therefore, the upper echelons of the Hunnic Legion decided to temporarily disband in order to wait for opportunities. After all, Albrecht could not always take the 5,000 men under him to protect the German immigrants in the royal estate for a long time. A horse bandit stronghold that had just been wiped out by Albrecht. Among the ruins, the soil began to loosen, and gradually the movement became larger and larger. As if a green plant was about to break out of the ground. With a dong sound, the wooden board was lifted, and Atima was lying on the ground inside, breathing in fresh air like a fish lacking oxygen. In fact, many aristocratic houses had cellars like this for hiding people. He escaped into the cellar as soon as the fire broke out, so he was able to escape. At this time, Atima was horrified to find two figures walking towards him. Atima was panicked at first, but when the other party got closer, he realized that they were actually two serfs of his own family, and he couldn't help but said angrily, "Damn thing, you still can't help me up." The two serfs remained silent. One of them walked directly behind Atima and stretched out his hand. However, the other serf did not want to help him up, but held his arm. "Hurry up, Dan," shouted the serf behind Atima. Matthew raised the hoe in his hand high, and Atima immediately started struggling. "Matthew, Dan, are you all crazy? I'm Master Atima." However, the two serfs did not listen to his explanation, and the hoe fell on their master's head. Then they tied him up with hemp rope and threw him into the cellar again. Matthew put the lid back on the cellar, and Dan moved a big stone from the side to put it on top. Then the two began to fill it with soil until it was completely buried. Although their hands could not stop shaking, and they were afraid that they would be punished, in order not to return to the old days, they still mustered up the courage to send the nobleman who crawled out of the ground back to the cellar. In the days that followed, Albrecht and his soldiers trained new recruits at royal estates across the country. These German immigrants and Hungarian refugees are very cooperative. After all, after experiencing so many ups and downs, even the weakest people have learned to be strong. The Hungarian refugees were caused by the previous floods, not by Franz's plundering of the population. I wrote about it in the previous chapter. If you are skipping to read it, please don't criticize the protagonist for being inhumane and deliberately burning people's fields. You can't see my reply, so it's mentioned in the article. The purpose of training militiamen is to protect their families and the country. Although these militiamen do not know what a country is, they know the importance of protecting their families. They also know that, if there is no so-called country, weak people like them will not even have a chance to protect their families. The militiamen were trained diligently, but Albrecht and his officers were still very demanding, and it was not just a matter of the military training style of this era. What's more important is that they all know that they can't always stay here to protect the farmers. Soldiers also have feelings, but they follow discipline more than feelings. A strong army must have iron discipline. Otherwise, it cannot be defeated unless there is a generation difference in weapons or a huge disparity in strength. Although Albrecht hoped that these civilians would never need to appear on the battlefield, because that would be a dereliction of duty as a soldier, but after listening to Franz's total war theory, Albrecht began to understand his father's approach. Total war was actually proposed by the German General Ludendorff during World War I. It was essentially an extension of on war. What he saw in Hungary made Albrecht realize that that day might not be too far away. Chapter 254 Daily. Vienna, Schönbrunn Palace. Franz, who was listening to Ajana's report, keenly discovered a problem. That is, the amount of ivory brought back this time was too large to be processed. It would take at least 10 years to realize it without devaluing it. All kinds of ivory products are not selling well in the Austrian market. Although the sales of ivory buttons and ivory fan bones are relatively large, their added value is very low, and they are only larger compared with other products. Since the Austrian Empire had not set foot in the colonial field before, it did not understand the low acceptance of ivory products in the market. Ivory products sold relatively well in the market of experienced colonists like Britain and France, and its high tariffs made Franz feel helpless. He did not want to be ripped off at all. At this time, European trade protection was still prevalent, especially the increased tariffs on luxury goods, which were almost exaggerated. Usually merchants could find middlemen to avoid tariffs, but Franz could not. Such large-scale smuggling would not be carried out by the French. Discovery was impossible, and revelations would seriously damage the royal family's reputation. Archduke Franz, I think you could promote pool instead of football. Ajani knew that Franz was worried about the trophies he brought back from Africa. She was not an economic expert, but she was very confident in knowing everything about eating, drinking and having fun. Play pool first. of all, Franz himself does not understand billiards. Secondly, he is sure that the dominant ball sports in the future will be football and basketball. Thirdly, pool balls do not look big and are very durable. It is estimated that the market will be easily saturated. Yes, the sport of billiards is very popular among aristocratic circles in France and England. And those young men don't seem to be interested in football, and the latter seems to be a catalyst for family conflicts. Although Ajani kept her tone calmer when describing it, Franz could tell there was something in the other person's words. Family conflict? This word is too serious, he said. After all, the friends around him represented unusual families. If a fight really broke out, it would probably be regarded as a political incident. No, it's not too late for you to listen to what happened recently before making a judgment. Ajani took out a notebook and read it carefully. On February 18, 1840, Lord Lebstein suffered a fracture in his left foot. On February 26, the eldest son of the head of the Taffy family had 2 teeth knocked out. And on March 11, Richard Metternich suffered a broken nose. Are they playing kung fu football? And why are so many feet injured? In fact, football in this era has no rules, and the level of violence is comparable to passionate football. Punches, kicks, elbows, knees, and even sand throwing are all allowed. Jenny took a football and placed it carefully on the ground. Archduke Franz, please come and try. This is not a shot put. Franz felt that there must be something fishy in it. Of course not. I'm your attendant, and I'm not a child. How could I play such a boring prank? Ajani spread her hands and smiled. It sounds like you have less time to play tricks on others. Having said that, Franz still tried it with his feet. So heavy, so hard. How can this be solid? Only then did Franz remember, let alone pneumatic tires, even rubber tires were not popular. How could there be modern football under such circumstances? This is the best football on the market, and it uses your vulcanized rubber technology. Otherwise you would be kicking an animal's bladder or stomach. The footballs of this period were mainly made of animal bladders or stomachs, filled with stuffing, and covered with a layer of animal skin. Even the shape was not round, but approximately round. Okay, so how many pool balls can I make with the ivory I brought back? Ajani raised 3 fingers and said, about 3 million. So little. Franz was a little surprised to know that nearly 10 shiploads of ivory had been plundered from the Ivory Coast alone, which was accumulated by the local indigenous people for decades. The Ivory Coast, known as the Ivory Coast, was completely plundered by Franz. As a result, he could only make 3 million billiard balls, which was really unacceptable to him. We need to further eliminate those that are not round enough or hard enough. Only 1/3 of them can be put on the table in the end. Moreover, the wear rate of billiard balls is far beyond Franz's imagination. The texture of ivory billiard balls is hard, and damage from frequent collisions with each other is inevitable. Then, what to do with the rest? Franz did not expect it to be so wasteful. In fact, the technology at the time could only make 5 billiard balls from 1 ivory, and the defective rate was very high. Of course they are sold to ignorant people and poor people who want to save face. Judging from Ajani's appearance, it seemed that she had done this kind of thing. In fact, the business of second-hand billiard balls was quite popular at that time, but most of the transactions were carried out in small circles, which required a very wide network of contacts. But how can ordinary people afford the price of billiards? Franz is still immersed in his fantasy of using sports to enhance national self-confidence and cohesion. Although the idea is a bit self-deceptive, as long as it is effective, its value cannot be completely negated. This is an aristocratic sport. Do you know how much a good marble countertop costs? Just 3 to 5 clubs are needed, and different materials must be used according to different functions, and special processing must be performed. Ajani was very proficient in this kind of luxury. Franz didn't want to refute, so he could only sigh. It seemed that his plan would be put on hold for the time being. The direction of promoting football is generally correct, and it is also in line with the development trend. But this matter still needs long-term consideration. For example, the rules and the ball itself need to be reformed to make it easier to promote. Okay, you win. But getting them to play pool won't work just by talking about it. You have to teach me first, so that I can play with them. As for how to promote it, it depends on luck. It's no wonder that Franz had doubts. The Austrian aristocratic circle was already in the habit of enjoying opera and instrumental music, or riding horses and hunting, while the rural aristocrats liked mountain climbing and fishing. Because Franz Karel had the same hobbies as Archduke John and the country nobles, he became an outlier among the nobles in people's eyes. Okay, Archduke Franz. But do you want to learn English pool or French pool? It seemed that Ajani was already prepared. When she rang the doorbell, someone started to get busy at the table tennis table next door. In fact, Franz wanted to use the rules of later generations to create a new Austrian style. Unfortunately, he had no contact with this sport at all, and could only learn the most popular British billiards at the time and the most famous in later generations, namely snooker. After listening to Ajani explain the rules, the noise in the next room also stopped. Only then did Franz discover that there was another door next to his study. This is Franz discovered a problem. Some women especially like to expand. For them, no matter how big the room is, they will find it insufficient. This is a pool hall. Archduke Franz, do you think I'm thoughtful? Ajani made a look like you are about to praise me. It was obvious that everything in front of her was done by her. But Franz doesn't quite understand one thing. What's the impact of whether or not he plays pool? Or maybe she was overthinking it, and she just had a preference for pool games. Chapter 255 Reason for Killing. As the Austrian Imperial government officially issued a notice to the Hungarian region, requiring severe punishment of the horse bandits, a total of 16 people, including the bandit leader, were subsequently sentenced to hanging, marking the end of the civil strife. But in reality this number is far lower than the actual number of participants. Since the beginning of the horse bandit rebellion, Archduke Albrecht has so far annihilated at least tens of thousands of horse bandits on the Hungarian plains, and countless civilians have been killed by these bastards. However, both Austria and Hungary do not want this scandal to expand, so 16 people is a relatively reasonable number. After all, too few people are not convincing. If there are too many, Austria's cruelty will be highlighted under the instigation of people with ulterior motives. At the same time, the Hungarian side's responsibilities were cleared. The unlucky man who was hanged was originally a death row inmate with no hope of survival, so it was not a wrongful death. It was a result that everyone could accept. After this incident, Kossuth understood one truth, that is, the unreliability of the great nobles. The relatively limited strength of the small and medium-sized nobles left them unable to fight back when facing the regular army. Therefore, only mobilizing the serfs and citizens was the magic weapon to defeat the powerful army. At the same time, the great nobles' antipathy towards Kossuth was growing day by day. In the past, due to this guy's duplicitous face, many prestigious families suffered losses, and some country nobles even sent people to hunt him down in order to vent their anger. Hungary's urban nobility represents the great nobility living in Austria and abroad, while the rural nobility represents local forces born and raised. It should not be confused with the Polish aristocratic system. Kossuth, who is well aware that the French Revolution triggered the national awakening movement in Europe, knows that nationalism is the only magic weapon to increase cohesion and defeat powerful enemies. Therefore, he decided to join forces with some Magyar scholars this time to determine their ancestral origins from Europe. Arrived in Asia. Their original intention was to distinguish themselves from other peoples in Europe, but due to the great feat of the Austrian Empire's successful recovery of Western Bosnia not long ago, the confidence of the rebellious Croats was unprecedentedly high. Some Croatian scholars stood up without hesitation and pointed out that it was the Magyars who seized the territory of the Croatians and drove them from the plains to the mountains. This made the scene awkward for a time. What is even more frightening is that this statement immediately caused a violent reaction in the Croatian region. Because the Magyars have been oppressing the Croatians for hundreds of years, the popularity of Magyarism in recent years has made the Croatians even more anxious. The Magyar people's assimilation methods were too cruel. Not only must other races be destroyed spiritually, but their bodies must also perish. This Magyar trend was first set off by Széchenyi. His ultimate idea was to make the nobles identify with and accept the serfs, and through this channel, they would eventually become equal to the nobles. Unfortunately, what was originally a good idea soon deviated from the expectations of this noble man, and became a tool used by them to prove that their nation is superior to others under the crown of Saint Stephen. The Croatians, who had the most say, and were also the strongest, bore the brunt of the attacks by the Magyars. Croatia has always been divided into two factions. One is the Imperial faction, which advocates loyalty to and reliance on the Austrian Empire, hoping to protect it from oppression through dealings with the empire and the royal family. The other faction is the Royalist faction, which advocates loyalty to the Kingdom of Hungary, and then actively embraces Magyarization by all members to become true Hungarians, so that they can avoid oppression. Both factions regard Count Korolev as their spiritual leader, but the harsh miser is completely uninterested in his compatriots, and has even clarified his relationship with them more than once. Historically, the Croatians made their choice at the end, and at this time, due to the return of West Bosnia, they felt a sense of importance that they had not experienced in hundreds of years. As a result, the Croatian scholar received strong support from his compatriots, and this situation was exactly what Metternich wanted to see. He felt that the Croatians could be used to check and balance the Hungarians, and it was best to make both sides suffer losses so as to facilitate Austria's rule. Although Count Korolev despised his compatriots and often even ridiculed them for not being smart enough, he was indeed a Croatian and naturally did not want Metternich to use those poor people as weapons. As an old rival for many years, Count Korolev knew Metternich very well, and most of the bad checks issued by the latter could not be cashed. It's better to be a happy idiot than to let your fellow man die in vain for an invisible dream. The two men were arguing with each other, causing the Regent Council to reach a deadlock again. Grand Duke Louis belonged to the politically indifferent faction, and he was happy to let them go, as long as they did not threaten the fundamental interests of the Habsburg royal family. Franz is quite satisfied with the current situation. Croatia will have to cut off from Hungary sooner or later, because the territory of the Crown of Saint Stephen is too large for Austria to control. Slovakia can move later, but Croatia and Transylvania, which have sharp ethnic conflicts, should be separated from them as soon as possible. The terrain of Slovakia is mainly mountainous, characterized by being high in the north and low in the south. Attacking from the south is like rushing across a flat plain, and about 80% of the population is concentrated here, making it difficult for it to form a separate force. As for Galicia, it is dominated by Poles and Ukrainians. They are at odds with other ethnic groups in the empire, and the terrain is also flat and undefinitionable. In addition, it has almost zero industrial capacity, making it difficult for it to gain independence. Because Belgrade was taken back at this time, the Austrian Imperial government could justifiably plant another nail in Hungary's back on the grounds of sending troops. Previously, the total number of garrison troops in Nordsavi fortress was only 1 regiment. If a war really broke out, it would have very little effect. Since Belgrade is surrounded by Serbia, there is nothing wrong with garrisoning 50,000 to 60,000 troops in a strategically important place. At a critical moment, this force can take advantage of the transportation convenience of the Danube River to seize the initiative on the battlefield and go to most of the locations where they should appear. Schönbrunn Palace, Royal Gardens. After many days, the two brothers Albrecht and Friedrich reunited again. The latter congratulated his brother on his glorious achievements in the Great Plains. "How's it going, brother? Franz's special operations method has benefited you a lot, right? I heard from the gang of soldiers that you can often achieve extremely exaggerated results of dozens or hundreds to zero with it." The more Friedrich talked, the more excited he became. He knew his elder brother's talent very well, and he was sincerely happy that the other party could prove his ability. However, Archduke Albrecht seemed to be in low spirits. He did not answer Friedrich's words, but said to Franz, "I haven't used the things you gave me." Franz saw the other person's expression and roughly understood the situation. After all, he felt the same way when he saw a dead person for the first time, but he didn't expect to see it in a general who was destined to go down in history. And the last time he was in Hungary, Albrecht didn't care at all when he was a murderer. "I'm glad you didn't use it. If you did, it means you're in dire straits. How should I put it? Uncle Albrecht, you are indeed the future star of the army." Friedrich sneered at Franz's flattery, which he despised. Albrecht drank the glass of wine in one gulp. Before I went, you didn't tell me that the enemies were all civilians. Franz poured himself a glass of juice and drank it in one gulp. As long as civilians have weapons and mount war horses, they are enemies, Albrecht said after a moment of silence. I don't know why you politicians must fight a total war, Franz sighed. When an avalanche occurs, no snowflake is innocent. Chapter 256. A strange combination of circumstances. Albrecht was a soldier with a strong sense of honor. If anyone else could achieve such a glorious victory on the Hungarian plains, they would definitely make people proud. For Franz, this ride was just an opportunity. As a time traveler, he certainly understands what kind of crisis the Austrian Empire will face in the future. An army that is loyal to oneself is very important to the ruler at any time. In order to survive the crisis of 1848, Franz must do everything possible to plump up his feathers. Hey, don't say such discouraging words. Okay, Friedrich really couldn't stand the riddle between the two, but he knew very well that killing in war was a heavy topic. It's just that as a soldier, Friedrich was obviously not as sentimental as his elder brother. He was still at the age where, if violence is not for killing, it is meaningless. Uncle Friedrich, do you have any good news that you want to share with us? As far as Franz knows, the Imperial Navy has not made any big moves recently. If there must be any, it should be another one. The refit of the 2 battleships was completed. The quality of the Egyptian battleships is really poor, and the cost of modification is very high, but compared with the price of shipbuilding, it is still very cost effective. If the Austrians were to build several warships themselves, although the quality would be guaranteed, it would take at least 10 years, which is too long for a big country that is growing day by day and needs to keep up with the pace of colonization. Speaking of which, thanks to the spoils of the Turkish-Egyptian war, otherwise Austria would have been able to organize a merchant fleet to colonize Africa. However, in Friedrich's eyes, it seemed that it was enough to attack the natives with merchant ships. Franz, do you know the real culprit who attacked us? Friedrich said mysteriously. Let me think about it. The British, the French, the Portuguese, the Dutch, or slave traders from a certain country? Franz already knew that the attack on him was not that simple. It was actually a conspiracy between the French and Brazilian slave traders. How did you know? After thinking about it for a while, Franz felt that he still needed to confirm the credibility of the source of the information. After all, this might also be a common conspiracy used by other countries to divert attention. Even if the old colonial empires are in a saturated state and can no longer eat the remaining dinner, this does not mean that they want other countries to encroach on their sphere of influence. Provoking war between competitors is also a common tactic of these established empires historically. France eventually captured West Africa, but this does not mean that other countries did not covet this land. For example, England may not have enough power to pass through West Africa, so it may want to use Austria to contain France. From the Ashanti in West Africa, to the Cape Colony in South Africa, to the Indian subcontinent, Afghanistan, the ancient countries of the East, and even New Zealand in distant Oceania and Hawaii in the Pacific, this new empire on which the sun never sets, can be said to be it spread wars all over the world. The most tragic of which was the money-burning Spanish Civil War. The intensity of wars in Europe during this era was much higher than in other continents. Faced with this British octopus who often stretched out its tentacles unwilling to be left alone, Franz was always on high alert. After all, they had inserted several nails in the east of the Austrian Empire, and even secretly supported Prussia and Hanover. Recently, our merchant ships transporting ivory to and from Togo have been attacked. This is really strange. After all, there are British warships cruising in West Africa all year round. The pirates who are active at sea all year round are cunning people. They usually only dare to rob a few private merchant ships, are not stupid enough to attack large and medium-sized merchant ships with state backgrounds. After listening to Friedrich's words, Franz felt a little incredible and blurted out, "You mean they hired pirates to attack our merchant ships?" Yes, they were a group of desperados from Portugal. Of course, this information was provided by the French supply depot in Morocco. After that, I had people capture all the guys who were in contact with them. Friedrich's words made Franz break into a cold sweat. Attacking supply depots in other countries for no reason was not a small crime. If it was not handled properly, it might turn into an unmanageable disaster. You didn't just send people to attack them, did you? No, no, no. Of course, doing this kind of thing will not leave anything for the other party to catch. The ones who attacked them were pirates. You also know that Morocco is the nest of pirates. The French established supply depots there because they deserved it. We are impatient. We are innocent. Not to mention those people are now buried in the belly of the fish, and the dead will not speak. After listening, he suddenly regretted talking about special operations with the Star of Naval Hope, because the latter was now addicted to it, and couldn't extricate himself. It's it to kill people and silence them. Not only that, I also destroyed the body, and destroyed all traces. Friedrich was obviously very proud of his actions. Here you go. But don't act so easily next time. It's too dangerous. Franz immediately breathed a sigh of relief. As long as no direct evidence was left behind, the French would not dare to provoke trouble rashly. As for the French who died tragically, since they decided to join the pirates, they should be prepared to bear this anger. Let's get back to the topic. What is their fundamental purpose for doing this? Do they think that just a few indigenous African tribes or a few pirate ships can stop our colonization? Franz asked with some confusion. These guys hope to provoke a conflict between us and the British, because the Gold Coast is British territory and the so-called northern tribes actually refer to the Ashanti Kingdom. Unfortunately, our intelligence preparations for West Africa were insufficient, and the indigenous survivors who attacked us did not explain clearly the ins and outs of their behind-the-scenes planning, so we would not connect the attackers with the British at all. After that, we left Togo directly, and now the French hope to use piracy to evoke our memories. As for the main reason for the intervention of the Brazilians, it was purely because we disrupted their business. Since our country supports the Brazilian government as a separatist force, they will naturally dislike us. Franz scratched his head. It seemed that lack of intelligence was not a bad thing sometimes. Austria's information about West Africa can be said to be extremely scarce, and Franz only knew about Ghana, but not about the Ashanti Kingdom. The local indigenous people in Togo also called the Ashanti Kingdom Kabilanan. Fortunately, we didn't directly crush the entire army at that time, otherwise the current situation would be difficult to deal with. This can only be blamed on the French conspiracy being so complicated that they confuse themselves. Haha. Franz said half jokingly. Haha. You are so right. Friedrich couldn't help laughing. After Albrecht heard the cause and effect, he could only sigh helplessly with a solemn expression on his face. This was obviously a conspiracy carefully arranged by an opponent, but the two protagonists, one of whom lacked geographical knowledge and the other did not understand the language, could not help but sigh. But he was extremely lucky. Not only did he escape unscathed, but he also thwarted the enemy's plot. However, the light of the goddess of luck will not shine on them forever. Who can guarantee that good luck will come to them when something similar happens again in the future? The French are really hateful. This is the consensus of almost all Austrians. After all, the hatred accumulated as neighbors for hundreds of years cannot be easily resolved. Do you have any good way to deal with them, Franz? Friedrich asked. Personally, he admired this nephew. After all, even if he had sufficient intelligence as a guarantee, he couldn't think of an idea that would raise blood pressure more than snatching the entire Egyptian fleet. Pirates attacked a French supply point in West Africa. Do you think the proud Gallic rooster will give up? Of course not. They will take this opportunity to invade Morocco. Yes, even if this incident had not happened, the French would not have let Morocco go. So we should remind the Moroccans. Historically, France has always hoped to turn North Africa into France's backyard. At this time, Algeria has been invaded. As long as the local resistance becomes weaker, the freed up French will deal with the Moroccans. Yes, the French have established so many supply points and trading posts along the coast of Morocco. This must be their early preparation to invade Morocco. According to you, should we let the Moroccans strike first? Yes, the French cabinet and military cannot come to a conclusion so quickly, and like the British, they have stretched the front too long. They have troops everywhere from Africa to the Americas. Although the French have already drawn up a plan to capture Morocco, okay, but it is not a wise strategy for them to take the initiative to start a war with Morocco when they are entangled in many wars at this time. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 257, France's Ambition. In fact, the Moroccans have long been intolerable to the French. The French came not only to eliminate pirates, but also took the opportunity to seize the Moroccan market point. In fact, Morocco not only has pirates, but also has a strong maritime trade team. However, due to the robbery of Austrian merchant ships, they were attacked indiscriminately by the Austrian navy. Afterwards, the French once again sent warships to cruise in the Moroccan Sea in the name of combating piracy, and sank a large number of merchant ships at the same time. Supply points and trading posts were established in its coastal areas, and monopolized Morocco's foreign trade point. When Algeria fell, the new Sultan of Morocco, Abdel Rahman, knew that sooner or later the French would attack his country. For this reason, ABD did something that no Moroccan ruler in history had done. He took the initiative to accept Algerian refugees, funded the construction of houses for them, and set aside land to provide for their livelihood. There are many refugees in Algeria who are highly educated, junior high school diploma, and have special skills. Many of them have successfully integrated into Moroccan society, and many have even become officials. ABD knew what the French wanted, but Morocco's strength at this time was not enough to fight France. So he pretended not to care about the behavior of the French. Not only did he strengthen trade with them, he even hired French people as instructors for his army. But in fact, Morocco purchased a large number of weapons from France and trained an army of 40,000 people, including 8,000 cavalry alone. At the same time, Abd also spent money to bribe French experts, set up factories in Morocco, and manufactured weapons to secretly support the Algerians' anti-French war. When he learned that the French supply point had been attacked, he felt that it was done by a certain tribe in his country, or by the Algerians who had fled. There were too many people in his country who had a blood feud with the French. Abd originally hoped to spend some money to get through, but unexpectedly the French official opened his mouth and demanded 1 million francs and 20 beauties. The dignified sultan of a country could only ask the other party for a few more days of grace, but at this time a letter made him murderous. In the following week, Abd wiped out all the French strongholds along the coast of Morocco and hunted down the French throughout the country, killing more than 800 people. When the news reached Paris, Guizot's face turned livid, and he angrily denounced Alban Rousin, the colonial secretary. Damn. Trash. First it was the Ivory Coast, now it's Morocco. What's going on? Why did those damn barbarians suddenly become so fearless? Why did ABD, the former model chief, lead an army to rebel? It wasn't him. ABD said it was pirates who did it. Alban Rousin retorted in a low voice. Damn. Idiot. Idiot. Do you believe anything that barbarian says? Use your pig brain, and don't force me to use my boots to wake you up. It's obvious that they killed people and left the responsibility to the pirates. So over the years, those dirty bugs have long been extinct. So how can they be so powerful to kill our great French soldiers? But the Austrians were attacked by pirates not long ago and lost 2 merchant ships. They also specifically reminded us to pay attention to pirates. Alban was pushed down by Guizot before he could finish his words. He was a civilized man, but recent events really made him crazy. First, the Austrian Empire inexplicably embarked on the road of colonization, and then 2 young people with strong blood actually knew how to tolerate it, and did not attack the British. Just when Guizot thought that the 2 teenagers were going to be in trouble on the road to colonization, their colonial journey came to an abrupt end. The matter was not over, but the success of indigenous attacks at this time made him unbelievable. First Ivory Coast, then Benin, and now even Morocco has begun to rebel. Moreover, Morocco's military strength was much stronger than that of those indigenous countries, with an army of 40,000 people, and it was close to Algeria, which was in chaos, so he had to think carefully. Alban, an idiot, could no longer be the colonial minister. Even if he gave more bribes, he could not make Gizet betray France. You must clean up Morocco's mess, otherwise you will spend the rest of your life in prison, not to mention your position as colonial minister. Alban left dejectedly. At this time, Marshal Soult came in, looking radiant, and even sang Marseillaise. My lord, this song is inappropriate, Gizet reminded. After all, this is the Orleans dynasty. Although it is a constitutional monarchy, it does not mean that the king really has no rights. Ah, you happy? Haha. I'm a little carried away, but it's better not to tell King Philip. Soult said. What makes you so happy? Miss Ophelia gave birth to your child. The 71-year-old Marshal Soult had a 17-year-old lover. The French cabinet knew about this. Apart from this, Gizet really couldn't think of anything that could make this half-buried old man so complacent. Ahem. Cough, cough. Mr. Gizet, don't joke around. The love between Miss Ophelia and I is pure. Soult coughed twice seriously. Look at this and your scowl will disappear. Soult handed Gizet a confidential telegram. This is confidential. Can I see it? Gizet asked. If possible, I would like to show it to everyone in France. It's so great. Long live France. Soult said a little incoherently. Gizet really couldn't think of anything to be excited about. Could it be that Napoleon Bonaparte was resurrected? But when he saw the contents of the telegram, his eyes immediately widened, and then tears flowed out uncontrollably. The 7-year Carlist War finally ended with Spanish government forces winning. When Isabel II turns 16, she will marry Louis Philippe's youngest son, and they will rule Spain together. Until then, France will once again make the world tremble. Unknowingly, Gizet's breathing became heavier. This news was too good. All these years of hard work finally paid off. Moreover, after the Spanish Civil War, France could invest more manpower and material resources in overseas colonies. Coupled with the Spanish market in colonies, France could catch up with or even surpass Britain in just one generation. At this time, the Spanish royal family owed a huge debt to France. They took the opportunity to use a trade agreement to tie the former to the latter's chariot. A giant would appear in Western Europe. Later, Belgium and Portugal would be included in a Western European customs union. It is definitely more powerful and domineering than the German customs union between Austria and Prussia. After the Spanish Civil War ends, the number of troops sent to North Africa can be doubled. Not to mention Morocco and Algeria. Troops can even be sent to Tunisia. After taking over all of North Africa, France still needs to get back what it lost in the Americas. Coupled with Spanish influence, it is not impossible to turn the entire America into France's back garden. Chapter 258 Presidential Campaign. The Spanish Civil War came to an abrupt end beyond Franz's expectations. According to normal development, this war should last for a long time. By then, Britain and France are likely to be trapped in the quagmire and unable to extricate themselves, and will have no time to take care of Austria, which is growing in strength, and win precious opportunities for its continued development. The war has been going on for more than a year, and both sides have continued to invest a lot of manpower and material resources. Especially the seesaw fighting in the Pyrenees Mountains has greatly affected the morale of the troops like a meat grinder. It is precisely because of this that Carlos, the initiator of the war, was shaken in his heart. He believed that, if this consumption continued, his side would become more and more dependent on the British. He no longer wanted to be a puppet of the British and use the Spanish as a puppet. Ordered to make a wedding dress for Britain, he found an opportunity to issue a shocking announcement to the entire army. Don Carlos prepares to end the civil war. In the end, Carlos and the regent Queen Christiana reached an agreement. Isabella II pardoned all Carolist members. Don Carlos self-exiled and renounced the Spanish throne. The reason why the Spanish Civil War turned out this way is entirely due to the British. In their eyes, Spain is just a testing ground that delays and consumes the energy of the French. It is obvious that supporting Don Carlos has never been about profit. The true purpose of the Anglo-Saxons, even if you are an idiot who doesn't understand the game of national politics, you should suddenly realize it. After being played for 7 years as a result, the puppet in the hands of the British suddenly broke free from the shackles that bound him, directly causing the situation to develop in the direction they least wanted to see. Point in this regard, Franz can only lament that things are unpredictable. But his layout will not change because of this, because he believes that the British will not be willing to watch their old rivals on the other side regain their dominance in Europe. Meanwhile, Virginia, USA. In a small inconspicuous cabin, sat a group of people who would influence the future history of the United States. One of the bearded old men wearing a general uniform and a cowboy hat was the 9th President of the United States. William Henry Harrison. Sitting on his left and right were the top leaders of the Whig Party, and sitting opposite him was his running mate, John Tyler, the 10th President of the United States in history. John Tyler was originally a political star of the American Democratic Party. However, due to the great differences between him and President Jackson, a maniac full of war ideas and a believer in the supremacy of force, he gave up the position of vice president and turned into a Whig Party. William Henry Harrison and John Tyler, the forces behind them were the plantation owner groups in the American South. During the economic crisis after 1837, it was these planters who supported the American economy. Although Martin Van Buren teamed up with Friedrich List to stabilize the US economy after taking over, his diplomatic concessions to Britain aroused dissatisfaction among many people. Members of the House and Senate also complained about the surge in military spending following a series of disastrous defeats with the French in the Battle of Texas. After all, the continuous growth of military spending means that corresponding taxes will increase. And on the contrary, subsidies in other areas will naturally decrease. This is not what the funders behind the congressman want to see. The current contradiction and challenge facing the United States is that northern factory owners want to reduce military spending, while southern farmers want to increase military spending for their own security. Although the above differences are irreconcilable, there is one point on which the two sides rarely agree, and that is their firm opposition to the weak foreign policy of the current government, such as the two concessions to the former mother country, especially the recent new concessions in Maine and the United States and British Canada. Demarcation of borders between Brunswick. The other time is the Caroline incident. I have talked about it before, but I won't talk about it now. Faced with the aggressive attitude of the British, Martin Van Buren once again chose to retreat, which completely disappointed the Northerners. The excited people took to the streets to march, holding flags high and shouting "Down with the traitors" and "Down with the coward and cowards." Iofan. Taverns, coffee shops, restaurants and other public places, all places where the public gathered, were filled with angry crowds. They were all talking about when will that son of a bitch Martin Van Buren sell the United States. Inside the cabin. Harrison put down his cigar, picked up a glass full of spirits, drank it in one gulp, and then said, "Martin Van Buren is a coward. He raised the army in the garden and put the navy in the bathtub. This guy only knows luxury and enjoyment, and he cannot protect this great country. Now America needs a real man to defend it, her territory and security, and I'm that person." Excellent. Mr. Harrison, you will definitely win the election, John Taylor said while applauding. "You are correct, my Mr. Vice President." Although the two tried their best to appear confident and relaxed, the farmers who were the sponsors were not happy at all at this moment. In fact, both Friedrich List and Martin Van Buren themselves knew that the hope of re-election in this election was slim, but unwilling to fail, they introduced Lewis Carter, who had the same military background as Harrison, from the Democratic Party. Sri Lanka. Later, Lister offered a condition in exchange for lowering tariffs on agricultural exports, and asked southern planters to stop supporting Harrison and John Tyler. These southern planters believed in Friedrich List. After all, if he had not reached a deal with the Russians and argued with the British on the cotton tariff issue, they would not be able to make any money at this time. So I owe him a favor. Moreover, in the minds of these slave owners, Friedrich List had no obvious political attributes or inclinations. He belonged to neither the Democratic Party nor the Whig Party, but he had always been concerned about the safety and future of the United States. such a talent be a true American point. However, they would not put all their chips on Friedrich List just because of their trust. In addition to him, they also needed to continue to win over the Whig Party, so they made the decision to reduce campaign funds. This made the confident Harrison and John Taylor extremely dissatisfied, because although money is not everything, lack of money is absolutely impossible, especially in a rich man's game like presidential election. Without sufficient financial support, winning is simply impossible. To their disappointment, the senior Whig Party officials sitting here remained silent at this time, seeming to have acquiesced to this result. Short-sighted. Idiot. Harrison was extremely angry. He felt pathetic for those people. The French are preparing for war to invade our great United States at any time, just like they did to the Commonwealth of North Africa and Central America. Cass is an idiot. He actually thinks he can defeat the British. This is the funniest thing of the century. It's a joke. As a former member of the Democratic Party, John Tyler certainly knew the virtues of those guys. Those guys are all slaves to money. As long as the money is available, they will believe in the noose that strangles them. The top leaders of the Whig Party remained unmoved. Harrison, who was forthright in words and deeds, slammed the door and left without saying a word. This hero in the Anglo-American War and the butcher of Indians was already 68 years old. The purpose of participating in the presidential election at the age of nearly 70 is more to worry about the future of the motherland. Because he once fought against the British and witnessed the power of the French army while traveling in Europe, this old general is better than most Americans. They all know how serious the situation they are facing now is. John Taylor also looked at those slaves of money with contempt, snorted, and quickly caught up with the former. In fact, John Tyler's governance ability was very good in history. He vigorously opposed the establishment of a national bank and defeated the conspiracy of the big industrial and commercial bourgeoisie to manipulate finance and monopolize federal power. This event indeed saved American democracy at the time. Of course, because of this incident, John Tyler became one of the worst presidents in American history. As soon as the two left the cabin, a broker found them and expressed his willingness to provide a large sum of money to help them campaign. Chapter 259 Presidential Campaign. To be honest, Franz was not interested in John Taylor because the latter was always a firm believer in America first. Apart from the interests of the United States, almost anything else was not within his scope of concern. But for Louis Cass, Franz really had no memory of his previous life. From the intelligence point of view, he had an unusual hobby of killing Indians, so he once received the good name, American evaluation, as a hero. In terms of foreign policy, he also won the title of uncompromising man because he advocated being tough on Britain. It's just that in terms of military affairs, this man seems to have different ideas from the former war maniac of the Democratic Party. Cass advocated cutting military spending and dismantling the militia. His reason was that there were less than 20,000 French troops in Texas. While this small force is needed to maintain law and order in a large area, it is also necessary to constantly guard against the Indians within the territory. Unless the French's brains suddenly break, there will never be any intention to attack the United States rashly. In fact, in order not to pin their hopes for border security on their opponents, the Americans and Mexicans signed a defensive alliance agreement earlier to deal with the threat from the French. Therefore, Louis Cass believed that an army of 100,000 was a complete waste. As long as a standing army of 30,000 was maintained, it would be enough to deal with the threats from Britain, France, and Mexico. He also believed that the British were too arrogant and that the Canadian colonial forces were vulnerable and could be easily eliminated by cutting off British maritime support. There is actually a basis for the US Navy to be able to defeat the British at sea. Historically, the US Navy once defeated the Royal Navy with an absolute disadvantage of 1/4 of its strength. Not only that, they have broken their blockade many times and even captured their merchant ships. It can be said that the only country in the world that had a naval battle with England at this time and achieved final victory was the United States. However, most of these naval battles were small-scale exchanges. Most of the ships participating in the battle were frigates and cruisers. Take the legendary Constitution of the United States and this war at that time as an example. It was only equipped with 28, 24-pounders and 10 or 12-pounder artillery piece. This kind of firepower is really not worth mentioning on the European battlefield. France didn't think the Americans could defeat the British at this time, and he didn't know what direction history would take if Louis Casse became the president of the United States. But now he does not want France to continue to grow in North America, nor does he want to see the United States being carved up by Britain and France. Therefore, he needs a strong person to control the entire situation, so that even if a war breaks out, he will not be defeated quickly. But Louis Casse was obviously a little ignorant. It was too fanciful to rely on 30,000 standing troops to deal with European powers like Britain and France. Moreover, France needed to intervene in the Civil War for the future, and he needed to find someone with enough influence to do it. John Taylor was a typical Virginian, a large plantation owner, and he sincerely liked and enjoyed the life of a slave owner. Otherwise he would not have taken the initiative to stand up for the South in his later years. For this reason, he lost all his family property in the North, and was saddled with an infamy that he couldn't clean up. As for Harrison, the old guy, his physical condition was very bad. Historically, a president who only served for 1 month died. There was not even the slightest possibility of surviving until the beginning of the Civil War. However, due to the vast influence of his family, it is still worth a little effort to win over the US election during this period. Was like a large-scale reality show in the 19th century. Of course, because there was no developed internet, social networks, media, and television broadcasts like later generations, the presidential candidates at this time did not hesitate to travel in person. Visit every state to proactively canvass for votes and debate with your opponent's supporters. The first scolding war between the two sides started in the newspapers. The Democrats accused the Whigs of covering up slave traders and even making deals with idiots who kidnapped members of the Austrian royal family, almost causing a serious international scandal. The Whigs repeatedly made a fuss about the Democratic Party's multiple fraud cases, especially the Samuel theft. They accused a Democratic official of stealing $1 million of national assets and absconding. What was even more frightening was that the lawyer William sent to investigate actually absconded again with money. Therefore, the Democratic Party must accept public investigation without reservation. In order to deflect the accusations against themselves, the Democrats accused the Whigs of participating in smuggling operations many times and profiting from them. The Whigs angrily scolded the Democratic Commissioner of Customs for this. Jess Hoyt was Martin Van Buren's henchman. He abused his power for favoritism, appointed and dismissed officials at will, and plundered the people's wealth. The leader of a party full of such scum. Where is the credibility? The Democrats once again changed the subject and poured dirty water on the other party. The Whigs support slavery and the abuse of black slaves. They have no humanity. The Whigs laughed at the fact that in the workshops of factory owners who supported the Democratic Party, the working conditions and treatment of workers were 100 times worse than that of black slaves. They even allowed sick and unemployed workers to die of illness. They were simply a group of beasts without conscience. We have no slaves in the North. We have no unemployment in the South. During the debate between Louis Casse and Harrison, due to being at a disadvantage for a long time, they actually threw a water glass at the other party. The other party did not show weakness and took off his shoes to fight back. In the end, it even developed to the point where one party raised his cane and the other drew his belt, and a duel took place in front of thousands of Americans. Although it was finally stopped, politicians in other countries still found it ridiculous. Louis Casse mocked Harrison as a bumpkin who didn't know how to respect others and wore a tattered general's uniform. Harrison mocked Louis Casse as just a colonel, and like those extravagant and corrupt officials in Martin Van Buren's administration, he used state taxes to buy himself exquisite outfits, just like the hypocritical aristocrats in European courts. The current White House is a little Versailles. Our country is suffering, but his ruler is enjoying himself in time. I want to share the joys and sorrows with the people of our country. This has almost become Harrison's mantra. Obviously this is a strategy that resonates As life in the United States has become worse and worse in recent years, many people have begun to miss the tyrant they ousted, Andrew Jackson. Therefore, John Taylor took the opportunity to package Harrison as the people's candidate and fighting hero, intending to create a hero of Dubuquoin to keep pace with Jackson, the hero of New Orleans. Although both men are called heroes, they are actually only because they carried out massacres of Indians in these two places. The campaign was so intense that John Quincy Adams, the 6th President of the United States, even commented, "The country is in unprecedented turmoil, with thousands of people listening to inflammatory speeches every day, and then spreading those words even further through themselves. What is the future of this movement? We have no way of knowing. But according to the laws of history, if these movements initiated by political parties are not stopped, sooner or later they will evolve into a revolution, just like the French Revolution." But, in fact, this presidential campaign is more like an entertainment show than previous political campaigns. Franz is one of the directors behind the screen of this entertainment show. He and a special person operate behind the scenes through a series of means, including monetary bribery. For example, one day the Whigs gave out candy to the people listening to the speech, and the next day the Democrats started giving out bread. Later, they developed a lottery to give away slaves, and the Democratic Party immediately followed up and said they would give away sewing machines in a lottery. The Whigs invited the orchestra of Johann Strauss Sr. to perform a waltz, and the Democrats invited Broadway to perform an opera. The scene was once very chaotic. Both sides also composed a lot of ballads to discredit each other, but it was the money's ability that determined the final outcome. After Franz bribed many voters, Harrison narrowly defeated Lewis Cass, who was backed by the Democratic Party. With Martin Van Buren out of power, John Tyler set out to clean up corruption in the US government. Friedrich List, the Secretary of State who once covered the sky with one hand, was naturally the first to bear the brunt. But when US government investigators arrived, the building was empty. Chapter 260. Why not make a bet? Why are things in Brazil always so bad? Franz wondered. He was really confused about the Brazilians' ability to get things done. Take trade as an example. Austria imports large amounts of natural rubber from Brazil every year. However, their production capacity has barely improved, and the outbreak of civil war has caused their output to drop significantly. It seems that Austria's rubber industry has a long road ahead, and relying solely on unstable import channels is not a long-term solution. At this time, Franz was supporting the development of hundreds of scientific research projects, but not many of them could be profitable in a short period of time. 4. Example, the instant coffee, which he had high hopes for before, was not welcomed by Vienna's upper class, which was known for its luxury. Instead, it was awarded the honor of the worst drink of the 19th century. The only people who showed any interest in this invention were the military. Military executives call it black gold because the bitterness of this drink has such a strong impact on people's taste, so there is no need to worry about being stolen by a soldier or being greedy. Although its taste may be unacceptable for a while, some knowledgeable people were surprised to find that coffee has the same refreshing effect as alcohol after tasting it. And it is not easy to get drunk, which is not easy for soldiers to perform tasks cause negative impact. It is also worth noting that several other advantages of instant coffee are also a big factor affecting purchasing. First of all, it is much cheaper than fresh coffee beans, and it also lasts longer, usually 1 to 2 times longer than coffee beans at the same time. On the battlefield, if you want to use a coffee machine to grind coffee finely, and then use precious fuel to brew it slowly, this kind of treatment is a luxury even for an officer, let alone an ordinary soldier. But if you want to drink instant coffee, it is much easier. Just a cup of hot water, and wait for 1 minute to enjoy a cup of fragrant coffee. This instant coffee can also solve the problem of excess coffee beans, but at this time Franz's coffee trees in Africa have just been planted, and this trouble will not occur until 5 years later with the official opening of the first department store United Forces near the Vienna train station. The new pedal sewing machine designed by Franz finally opened the market. The sales volume of pedal sewing machines increased exponentially, and large orders came in like snowflakes. Only 1,000 pedal sewing machines were originally sold a year, but sales increased tenfold in 1 month. It is true that the pedal sewing machine is indeed a major advancement in the history of sewing machines, but such growth is also due to the addition of royal star power, which gave this department store unprecedented attention. Of course, it would not be possible without a Jenny, the capable planner. She came up with the creative idea of having a pedal-operated sewing machine compete with a hand-operated sewing machine, and if the challenger using the latter succeeded, he would receive a prize of 10,000 florins. This proposal indeed caused a great sensation among the people, not only those textile experts who wanted to get bonuses, but also many ambitious businessmen who wanted to use this to become famous. Soon the news spread throughout Austria via railways and newspapers, and even many interested people in Germany and Italy expressed concern. However, the result of the entire competition is shocking. It can be said that the pedal sewing machine is completely unilaterally beating the hand-operated sewing machine. No matter how skilled and skillful the user of the latter is, he will be ruthlessly crushed in the endpoint. Although many unexpected situations occurred during the competition, such as a certain machine malfunctioning, even if it was faster than repairs, the pedal sewing machine was far ahead, and the completion of the work was even worse. In fact, the real value of this competition is not to prove that pedal sewing machines are better than hand-operated sewing machines, but to open people's horizons and let them know this brand new tool for the first time. Most of the people who placed orders with Franz were factory owners, who were keenly aware that this new machine could greatly improve the work efficiency of textile factories. The owners of clothing factories and tailor shops are also full of praise for the huge potential of this product, and believe that it will be an indispensable tool to ultimately improve the efficiency of the entire Austrian clothing industry. But the problem came again. This time it wasn't that the sewing machine couldn't be made. Thanks to the help of the hydraulic press, Austria's precision parts manufacturing industry could be said to be absolutely number one in the world at this time. The efficiency of the clothing industry has increased more than 10 times, but the weaving industry is still producing according to the previous market demand. The sudden surge in orders has forced the weaving industry to expand production capacity. However, they soon encountered an embarrassing problem. That is, Austria did not have enough cotton. Therefore, the dividends of this industrial revolution did not benefit ordinary people. Instead, they caused a wave of unemployment to a certain extent. However, all this was within Franz's plan. Instead of reducing the scale of the industry, he took the opportunity to expand the scale and acquire a large number of competitors' factories and downstream industries. The behavior of the Grand Duke was very abnormal, which made many people smell something different, but no one dared to place a bet. Because they don't have the huge size of the royal family, they can't bear such exaggerated risks. Moreover, the clothing industry in this era was just beginning. Both rich and poor people preferred to go to tailor shops to sew clothes. Only employees and some relatively wealthy technicians liked ready-made clothes, but that is just a matter of price and style. The future world must belong to clothing factories. Franz is convinced of this. Jenny was extremely puzzled by Franz's actions. Although the latter became the dominant player in the entire garment industry in a short period of time, due to overcapacity and the hiring of a large number of skilled workers who did not work, profits were reduced. A sharp decline. Jenny is not one of those uninformed businessmen. She knows that Franz has established many plantations in Africa, but their scale is not enough to support the raw materials needed by Austria's entire clothing industry. For this reason, she even went to see Mr. Sina, honorary president of the Austrian Federation of Industry and Commerce, the actual person in charge, who also believed that if this continued, Archduke Franz's clothing factory would suffer losses. Archduke Franz, would you consider suspending your acquisition plan? Why? Franz said, if you look at the performance reports, the profits of garment factories across the country are already very thin. If this continues, they may fall into full losses. If the cotton crisis happens again, it will be a disaster for you. Jenny expressed her concern again, but Franz still looked unconcerned. This is not something worth worrying about. Moreover, the sales of sewing machines are very hot now, and the profit can be used to expand the scale of the garment industry. And I have told you before about the advantages of monopoly. As long as we occupy the entire market, everything will it's all going to be fine. How is that possible? How can nobles buy those cheap ready-made clothes? What's more, farmers living in the countryside will not take the initiative to buy those expensive clothes. You know the living habits of those people. They can even wear a dozen of clothes. Years are nothing unusual. Do you know why? If you wear a piece of clothing for more than 10 years, it's because of the price. They can't afford it. As long as we lower the price, it will be fine. Ajani shook her head. She felt that Franz was a little too whimsical. If the price is lowered, what is the point of our monopoly? Where does the profit come from? Archduke Franz, from ancient times to the present, no matter in any country or in any era, there are always people who cannot afford to wear clothes. You are so naive. Just like you tried to put shoes on all the people in this country. In the end, you only managed to put shoes on all the soldiers in this country. In fact, you have done well enough. This is a feat that even Queen Assad was unable to accomplish back then. Then let's make a bet. Franz said with great interest. Chapter 261. Everyone has clothes to wear. Starting in October 1840, a large amount of cotton from West Africa flooded into the Austrian domestic market. An adequate supply of raw materials allowed Franz's factory to be fully operational and produce finished products subsequently. The ready-made clothes that left the factory were not only spread throughout the empire through railway transportation, but also flowed into the markets of Germany and the Apennines through the convenience of the customs union. Most of the target users of these ready-to-wear products belong to workers and lower middle class groups, and they happen to live in cities distributed around transportation hubs. A large number of cheap clothes quickly overwhelmed those self-righteous tailor shops. Except for a few stores that sell high-end goods, they have directly suffered a Waterloo-style blow to dimensionality reduction in the mid to low-end clothing market. Relying on the advantages from later generations and the aesthetics that are nearly 200 years ahead of this era, coupled with the help of a group of royal tailors, Franz's factories had successfully designed a large number of trend-setting ready-to-wear styles. However, he clearly realized that, in order to maintain his position as a leader in the clothing industry, relying on his own strength alone was far from enough. So he sent someone to contact the Vienna Academy of Arts and asked them to send a professional team to help him train fashion designers. The Vienna Academy of Arts is a public college founded in 1692. It is one of the oldest art academies in Europe, but at this time it has long lost its original glory. Historically, with the decline of the Austrian Empire and the decline in government funding, and the scarcity of social donations, in order to maintain daily expenses and livelihoods, its senior officials had no choice but to reduce the admission rate of publicly funded students, making it the most difficult exam in Europe. One of the art colleges. To make matters worse, instead of attending art colleges, aristocrats and wealthy businessmen preferred to go to a real top university such as the University of Vienna. However, thanks to the butterfly effect, the Austrian economy was booming at this time, and the empire's fiscal revenue soared, which allowed many public schools to benefit from the support of public funds again. Thanks to the success of the German Zollverein, Austria became a gathering place for a large number of highly educated and highly qualified North German talents. Among them, Vienna, the heart of the empire, had an even greater concentration of elites for nobles and businessmen. How to use wisdom or academic qualifications to show their differences is a problem that has always troubled them, so art appreciation has become their unique weapon. In order to integrate into local life, high quality talents flowing in from other regions have also joined this vast army of art appreciation. And those wandering artists who should have stayed in parks and cemeteries and slept in soup kitchens were all pulled out to perform for everyone in public places. In the past, only large-scale events or infrastructure projects led by the royal family could benefit them and obtain a job with a relatively stable income, such as celebrations for the emperor's birthday, public works completion ceremonies, and Franz and a number of well-known celebrities, or 1,000 Years Against the Waves, created publicly by masters in the music industry and so on. Due to the increasing prosperity of the art appreciation market and the accompanying fierce competition, the prices of almost all handicrafts have been pulled to a very low level. Of course, the income of the scroll kings, who can still win under this situation, is not as good as before. Same thing point in theory, in this era of booming art and economic development, there should be no reason for a long-established institution like the Vienna Academy of Fine Arts to decline point. However, the competition in the art world in Vienna has reached a life and death level, resulting in the job income obtained by many students after graduation being less than that of wandering painters on the street point. This has raised serious doubts about the quality and level of teaching at this ancient college point. At the same time, potential female students, who were supposed to be an important source of funding for the Vienna Academy of Arts, all chose the Royal Academy for Women in Vienna point. In the past, some great nobles who doted on their daughters would send them to the art academy in the capital of the empire, so that the girls could be released without violating the morals of the nobles. However, with the emergence of the Royal Academy for Women in Vienna, many nobles changed their original intentions. Although Vienna can be said to be relatively relaxed in terms of women's education, the mainstream of society still believes that this is a waste of money and the cultivation of witches. This time, the royal family took the initiative. If the monarch at this time was a normal person without mental or physical illness, some people might still raise objections, but after the debate in Vienna's Central Park, no one felt that way anymore. After all, Ferdinand I and his younger brother Archduke Franz Karl did not fall into the category of normal people, so no one would care about their victory or defeat. But if it were their turn, the consequences would be completely different. If you lose, your reputation will be ruined at best, and your body will be shattered into pieces at worst. Originally, the Habsburg royal family was known for its kindness, but with the revival of church power, their instinctive vigilance made their willingness to act as the royal black glove stronger than before. The reason is very simple. No one in the empire, except the royal family, can rule the church. Since you can't beat them, then join them has always been the way for nobles to survive. But in this way, the Vienna Academy of Fine Arts lost an important source of income. At this time, they can only choose to be strict in and out to improve their reputation again. And Franz's proposal, like the rain, brought it back to life. In addition to the fashion design major, at Franz's suggestion, the Vienna Academy of Fine Arts also opened advertising, journalism, architecture and other majors. However, at this time, Austria's cotton production in the African colonies was still too small. After a brief period of madness, the problem of insufficient raw materials once again plagued the entire Austrian clothing industry. Just when the Central European countries thought they had finally got a chance to breathe, the newly elected President of the United States announced the first presidential order, give the Austrian Empire most favored nation status and dump large amounts of cotton into it. It stands to reason that this order is quite satisfactory. It is understandable that the Americans would do this in order to seize the cotton market. But at this critical time, it dealt a heavy blow to Germany and the countries on the Apennine Peninsula. This order was equivalent to cutting off the possibility of the other Central European countries come back at the source. Massive amounts of American cotton flowed into Austria, were processed into cotton cloth and clothes through factories in the empire, and then poured into the Central European market. Their streets and alleys are almost filled with finished clothing products from Austria, making it impossible for other countries to compete with them. Whether in terms of quality, price, or style, Austrian products have an absolute advantage that is unmatched. Many economists are worried that, after monopolizing the clothing market, the Austrians will take the initiative to raise prices in order to seek higher profits. Prussia, in particular, has thrown out a lot of conspiracy theories to slander Austria and the Habsburg royal family. However, what is surprising is that Austria not only did not make a fuss about price increases, but also actively informed the public through announcements that its clothing products would be sold at reduced prices, saying that this would allow more middle and lower class people to enjoy get the convenience you deserve. Of course, different places have different propaganda models. For example, the public slogan in the German Confederation is "Let every German have clothes to wear." In Austria, the slogan is of course "Let every Austrian have clothes to wear." In the Apennines, the rhetoric is different. In short, this time, Franz not only made a lot of money, but also took the opportunity to gain a good reputation. In fact, Selling at reduced prices is a more long-term strategy because it raises the threshold of the industry and makes it difficult for competitors from other countries to compete with it. As for those who are unemployed, this is an excellent opportunity to encourage them to choose to work in Austria. After all, the railway transportation in Alitania is now so convenient, and even if you can't work as a worker, you can still choose to work in agriculture in Translatania. If none of the above methods work, there is still a good way out to overseas colonies. Chapter 262 Winning Ma. Franz's heroic words of wanting everyone in Austria to have clothes to wear were not empty words. With the expansion of the market space within the empire and the formation of a relatively stable cotton supply chain, clothing with the advantage of low prices will take advantage of favorable transportation conditions and flood into all parts of the country. In this way, it can not only reduce production costs, but also greatly meet people's demand for daily necessities and stimulate employment. At the same time, these clothes are also a weapon in the hands of the Austrian Empire. For example, Saxony has the strongest textile industry. Cotton is provided by Austria, and the market is dominated by Austria. As a middleman, it can only choose to follow Austria's footsteps. In recent years, Prussia, the second child of the German Confederacy, has been in an uncomfortable state. Originally, its own pillar industry, the once glorious Silesian textile industry, was already in decline, and it had to face the trade dumping of the Confederacy by the giant British. The German customs union was finally established, but the Austrian tiger came out halfway. Originally, the Prussians hoped to use state subsidies to support their own clothing industry to fight against the Austrians. However, the heavy blow from the Americans directly killed them. Not only did it lose millions of tailors, it also spent a lot of manpower and material resources, but it ended up with the only option being to sell the factory and machinery at a low price. What is even more difficult for them to accept is that Austria became the ultimate beneficiary of this large acquisition. However, compared with the fiasco in the clothing market, Frederick William IV had another headache that troubled him more, and that was the dissatisfaction of the constitutionalists in Prussia. The military led by the Junker nobles held a tough attitude and advocated taking this opportunity to abolish the constitutionalists and attack and weaken those speculative businessmen, which could be described as killing two birds with one stone. Due to the food crisis in previous years and the impact of the Austrian Empire joining the German Zollverein, the strength of Prussia's liberal constitutionalists was much weaker than in history. On the contrary, the voice of the Junker landowners continued to grow louder. However, William IV did not have the courage to break this fragile political balance. He was worried that without the restraint of the liberals, the conservatives and the military would be able to dominate the country and eventually escape the control of the monarch like a wild horse. He was even more afraid that this would repeat the tragedy of the French Revolution. At the same time, another dangerous force was growing rapidly in Prussia, the radicals. These are people whose views are far more threatening than conservatives and liberals combined, such as their strong support for the abolition of the monarchy and its replacement with a republic. In fact, not only Prussia, but the entire German Confederation was filled with such voices. Even Austria was not immune to this. This was especially serious in some small princely states, where even the political parties that ruled the country were Republicans. This made William IV so frightened that he could not sleep at night. Therefore, he and the conservative leader Metternich jointly enforced the law across the country. The times are becoming more frequent. But even so, the situation has not improved. He neither wants to anger those constitutionalists nor hand over the precious power in his hands. After thinking about it, I decided to be a deaf person and ignore those voices for the time being. Although it is constantly challenged politically by radical ideological trends in the economic and trade fields, Austria can be said to have achieved frequent successes after its ready-made clothes entered the German Customs Union and the Apennine Customs Union. They also poured into Serbia, Wallachia, Moravia, and the Balkan territories under Ottoman jurisdiction along the Danube River's transportation convenience. Unfortunately, this batch of ready-to-wear clothes didn't cause much of a stir in the area. The main reason is that the living standards in these countries and regions are really too low. The poor locals prefer to buy coarse fabrics rather than ready-made clothes. although the profit in the fabric business is lower. As the saying goes, a fly's legs also have flesh. Not to mention that this is just a stepping stone point. In fact, France's real intention in urging the opening of the Balkan market was to export culture so as to cultivate a group of spiritual Austrians. After the Turkish-Egyptian War, Egypt and the Ottomans had opened their doors to Austria. The only trouble was that the clothes sold to them needed special modifications to make them more in line with the local aesthetics. In fact, through the years of westernization movement of Ali and the Ottoman sultans, these two places have cultivated a large group of spiritual Europeans, so Austrian goods can unexpectedly sell well here. However, Egypt and Ottoman also had their own considerations in doing so. With the war in the Near East coming to an end, the French have temporarily withdrawn from the competition. As for the remaining two powers, Britain and Russia, one hopes to dominate their market, and the other has never concealed its ambition for their land. Although in comparison, the British's methods are gentler than those of the Russians, their trade hegemony still makes Turkey and Egypt somewhat unable to bear it. At first, the goods imported by the British seemed to be of high quality and low price. However, after the French, a strong competitor, withdrew, they took off their masks and revealed their bloodthirsty fangs. The first thing to increase in price was weapons, followed by cotton cloth and saltpeter. In just 1 year, the prices of commodities other than grain and wood almost doubled. The grain and timber trade was dominated by the Russians. They did not interfere with the prices, but the output volume was really unacceptable to the Ottoman Empire. Majid could only borrow money from the British to build ships, and a large amount of grain became war reserves. Majid was not an incompetent monarch, and he quickly recognized the problem, which was that the Ottoman Empire was becoming increasingly dependent on Britain, and was getting less and less profit from trade. In the past, a high quality carpet could be exchanged for 20 guns, but now it can only be exchanged for 10, and they are still old-fashioned flintlock guns, not the latest percussion guns. Majid knew that this was what would happen if there was only one tiger in the mountains, so he hoped that another tiger would appear and let them compete, so that the Ottoman Empire could obtain the maximum profit. In fact, the first person he thought of was the French. Although they had been supporters of Egypt, Majid believed that France was the only country in the world that had the ability to compete with England on the economic, political, and military levels. Not only him, many of the Ottoman high-level people who have been to Europe are full of admiration for France, a country that almost single-handedly ruled Europe. From a historical perspective, the Ottoman Empire was at its most glorious when it relied on the Holy Alliance formed with its half-brother France to suppress the Habsburgs. I think of the time when Suleiman the Magnificent devoured thousands of miles like a tiger, defeated Hungary, beheaded its king, besieged Vienna several times, and made all European countries pay tribute. Unfortunately, the French did not intend to give their once close comrade in arms the opportunity to revisit their old dreams, and ruthlessly rejected Majid's proposal. Guizot, the leader of the pro-British faction, even reached an agreement with the British to jointly control commodity prices. Russian products are not competitive at all, and no normal person would choose Russian products. The Prussians' products were superior to those of their eastern neighbors, but their scarcity and high shipping costs made them prohibitive. General goods were simply not enough to offset the huge impact of British goods on Near Eastern trade. At this time, there was no German craftsmanship that would be talked about by later generations. Prussia is now known as Yawu in Europe, and their products are famous for their low quality and low quality imitations. Originally, due to the feud between the two parties, Austria itself was not in Majid's consideration. He had no good impression of this country. In addition, the other party's behavior of taking advantage of the situation during the war in the Near East deepened his disgust. But when he saw those cheap ready-made clothes, he was shaken. Majid soon showed his agility as a qualified monarch, and he decided to let the Austrians join this beast competition in order to lower the price of British goods. As a result, with the official encouragement of the Ottoman Empire, Austrian products quickly became popular in the Near East. The British immediately felt the pressure and had to cut prices on their goods, causing profits to plummet. You must know that the Anglo-Saxons have never been players who abide by the rules, so they immediately found the Americans and prepared to solve their competitors at the source. Previously, the newly inaugurated President John Tyler made a request. Harris died of illness to redefine the boundaries of the United States and British North America. The British, who wanted something from the other side, had to agree to their demands and promised not to cross the border again and invade American territory. Soon the clothing products of the Austrian Empire withdrew from the Anatolian market. Just when the British were complacent about achieving their goal, they didn't know that this was actually a deal reached by representatives of France and John Taylor, making the latter once again owe the former a huge favor. The Americans won the border negotiations, and the Austrians successfully completed their plan to show weakness to the British. After all, France doesn't want to be remembered by the British. What Austria needs most now is time. Majid successfully used the goods of his former enemy to suppress the price of British goods. After this game of chess, everyone felt that they had won. Chapter 263 Napoleon's Legacy. The establishment of the July monarchy was, in a sense, rather due to the departure of Napoleon Bonaparte and the collapse of the First French Empire, which brought this European hegemon to its bottom point. The lack of security and pride brought by political strongmen forced the French to pin their hopes for national rejuvenation on the Orleans family, a branch of the Bourbon dynasty that once brought France to glory. For example, if the Orleans dynasty was a religion supported by the people, then Louis Philippe would be the high priest at the altar. Although 25 years have passed since the war that lasted for more than 10 years in Europe, the entire Napoleon family has already left France, and the emperor's body is still stranded on St. Helena Island. But the French have no regard for this. Courcy Marie Claire's admiration and love have not diminished at all. This made Louis Philippe, who thought he was superior to his predecessors, felt very unfair. He clearly accomplished something that Napoleon could not accomplish in his lifetime, conquering Spain, but he still lives in his shadow. Escorting Napoleon's ashes back to Paris has even become a daily routine for the Bonapartists. These people hold public events every month near the Palais Bourbon or in the streets of Paris to announce their presence. Even today, after Louis Philippe won the Spanish Civil War and returned French power to North America, Bonapartists still compare him to Napoleon. Well, gentlemen, I would like to announce to you that I have summoned the British ambassador and asked him to convey to his government a request of mine that the body of Napoleon Bonaparte be returned to Paris. Also, I'm prepared to have it returned to Paris, buried in Les Invalides by the Seine. When Louis Philippe announced the news in the Tuileries Palace, everyone present fell silent. They looked at each other, trying to see whether they heard correctly from the other's face. Seeing the surprised expressions on everyone's face, Louis Philippe had to repeat his decision again. However, the hall still did not burst into warm applause. On the contrary, it was filled with emotions of surprise, fear, uneasiness, and anger. However, there was still a minor trouble at this time. Louis Bonaparte, later Napoleon III. Louis Bonaparte was at odds with his uncle's brothers and looked down upon even his uncle Joseph, not to mention Napoleon's other two brothers. Of course, the French government has not forgotten this young pretender to the throne. They succeeded in wooing one of Napoleon's illegitimate sons, Count Leon. Like his biological mother, this man was very vain and was not welcomed by Napoleon Bonaparte and his relatives, so that they had been living a life of poverty. Later, an official employed by the French government told the Count of Leon that, as long as he could fight Louis Bonaparte in a duel, no matter whether he won or lost, he would get a commission of 100,000 francs. Soon the down and out prince was off to London, where he not only publicly humiliated Louis Napoleon, but also discredited him and challenged him to a duel. The purpose of the French government doing this is actually very simple, that is, to discredit the nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte. So whether he accepts the duel or not, the outcome doesn't matter. If Louis Bonaparte had refused, his political influence would have evaporated. If he accepts it, no matter whether he kills the other party or kills himself, he will not escape the reputation of fratricide. But sometimes, history is so wonderful. Louis Napoleon did not want to participate in this duel, but people around him told him that this duel was more important than his life. He had no choice but to accept it. On the day of the duel, both Louis Napoleon and Leon were filled with a deep sense of fear. At this time, the former began to try to persuade the latter not to kill each other and smear the family, and at the same time, asked him whether he had been coerced or bewitched by outsiders. After hearing this, the latter confessed to the French government in one breath and also mentioned the 100,000 franc transaction. Because he could not get the approval of Napoleon's family, Leon could not enjoy an annuity. After Napoleon's death, he lost his financial resources, so he took risks. Listen, I'll give you 150,000 francs to give up the duel. I think my reputation is worth 200,000. Okay, it's a deal. Ever since this farce came to an end, it was the skill with which he dealt with this incident that earned Louis Napoleon the superficial approval of his uncle's brothers, who went to the same theaters together as a sign of their harmonious relations. Soon after, Louis Napoleon decided to launch another uprising in response to the actions of Louis Philippe's government. He chose the French coastal city of Boulogne, where only 250 soldiers were stationed. Captain Arades was a typical Bonapartist and immediately agreed with Louis Napoleon's plan. After meeting him, Louis Napoleon's plan was to take control of Boulogne and march directly to Paris, until he overthrew the July monarchy. To this end, he recruited some veterans and unemployed workers, and at the same time, made contact with the Polish nationalist army. So far, the number of people who have conspired with him has reached 500. However, this mixed group composed of French and Polish people does not understand the ins and outs of the entire plan, and even has no simple idea of when to set off, or where to go. However, the details are not known. Louis Napoleon naturally understood this principle, so he borrowed 500,000 francs from a British official very early, and wrote IOUs to 56 people, raising a total of 1.02 million francs. The weapons needed for the uprising were imported from Britain, including Brown Bess rifles and Birmingham steel knives. The flags and military uniforms were purchased from Paris. In order to expand his influence, he even ordered a hand-operated printing press to print and distribute leaflets. On August 5, 1840, 5 carts of food, 20 war horses, 2 boxes of military uniforms, 3 carts of weapons and thousands of leaflets were transported into Boulogne. Louis Napoleon swaggered into the local military camp, but was ignored by the lazy soldiers, until Lieutenant Arades gathered them together. He delivered an impassioned speech to the soldiers, but unfortunately it did not resonate with those short-sighted people, so he had no choice but to promise them generous benefits, money, medals, and official positions, while the soldiers were cheering and celebrating. Someone suddenly shouted, "The military police are coming." The scene suddenly became chaotic. Louis Napoleon and his followers started shooting in panic, wounding many soldiers. The soldiers then began to fight back, and the uprising failed. At this time, Louis Napoleon could only choose to flee to the sea, and then board a ship to leave France. However, they encountered the French army halfway, who showed no sympathy, and opened fire directly on them. After 15 minutes of fighting, 3 conspirators were shot dead, and 1 person drowned in the river. However, this was still 5 kilometers away from the sea. The desperate Louis Napoleon had no choice but to surrender. His attempt to imitate his uncle ended in failure again. The time, 3 years, money, about 2 million francs, and energy he had spent on it all seemed absurd at this moment. Louis Philippe seemed very satisfied with this victory. He believed that the Corsican nephew failed because the soldiers loved him more than Napoleon Bonaparte. However, the actual situation was that the soldier who shouted, "The military police are coming," was only 14 years old at the time. He did so out of curiosity and play. Unfortunately, he became the only French soldier killed in the battle. A stray bullet hit his eye and ended his life. After the incident, Louis Philippe decided to imprison the restless pretender to the throne to avoid future troubles. At this moment, he believed that he had completed the first step in becoming the Emperor of France. Afterwards, he would personally proclaim Napoleon Emperor of France and take over his sword and scepter. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story, and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 264, Mathematician Mendel. 3 years ago, the old Mendel, who successfully cultivated high-yielding wheat, received the 20,000 florin bonus promised by Franz, freeing his family from their long-term poverty of life. Old Mendel repaid all the 1,700 florins he borrowed to treat his wife's illness. He also purchased 200 acres of land in his hometown of Heinzendorf, hired 2 servants, and stored the remaining money in the bank. Can be regarded as fulfilling his simplest dream as a farmer, and his son Gregor Mendel also benefited from it. This great biologist, who will be world famous in the future, gave up his plan to save money to study at Amidst University. Instead, he relied on his spirit of hard work and his outstanding ability to surpass ordinary people, and finally passed the entrance examination with excellent results. The best institution of higher learning in the Austrian Empire, University of Vienna. However, unexpectedly, he did not take biology as his main subject of study, but instead chose mathematics. Soon the future giant in the biological world showed surprising talent in mathematics, which made Franz very embarrassed after learning the news. Although you are familiar with the life experience of this scientific giant in history, you can never go to a mathematical genius and tell him solemnly, mathematics is not suitable for you. Biology is your true destination. Of course, in your free time don't forget to plant peas. 3 years later, when Franz met little Mendel again, the dark, thin and reserved boy had now grown into a fat little white man. The passage of time had not diminished his gratitude to the Archduke in the slightest point. After all, without the latter's generous help, their family would have been struggling in the quagmire of poverty as in history, and his father would have accidentally broken his leg at work, causing the family to lose their source of income. They can only survive by relying on help from others. Although the old Mendel earned the 20,000 florins through his own skills, he, like his son, was still very grateful to Franz for giving him this golden opportunity and helping him recover the one that had been hacked. 16,000 florins in addition. The earth-shaking changes in almost every aspect of Austria over the years gave old Mendel a great impression of the empire and its rulers, the Habsburg family. Your Highness, it is my honor to see you again. After taking off his hat and saluting, little Mendel said sincerely, hello, it's an honor to meet you, Mr. Mendel. Franz's words flattered the other party. You actually know my name. What an honor. Franz has become accustomed to receiving crazy compliments from others almost every day after time travel, but he was still a little embarrassed to accept such a respectful attitude from such an important scientist in human history, so he took the opportunity to change the subject. You don't have to be like this. I'm here to ask you a few questions. Mendel retracted his hand and said respectfully, this is my honor, Archduke Franz. Can you honestly tell me what you think of this country? The Austrian Empire is a great country. Although it is a bit autocratic and conservative, I think there is a reason for this. Little Mendel suddenly realized that he might have said something wrong and immediately changed his words. I'm talking about authority. Yes, the empire is very authoritative. This is very good. I love it very much. Long live the empire. There is no doubt that he is a man with a very strong desire to survive. But what Franz didn't expect was that certain concepts had become so deeply rooted in people's hearts. It seems necessary to take some measures in advance, otherwise it will be too late when 1848 comes. I know. Don't worry, this is a secret conversation. No one will record it, and no one will hold you accountable. Franz's original intention was to appease the restless genius in front of him, but it had the opposite effect. At this moment, little Mendel became even more frightened. He felt that this was too abnormal. He was obviously just a unknown college freshman. Even if he had met the Crown Prince a few years ago, it was impossible for him to remember him. The only explanation is that the incident was exposed. Sure enough, you still have to be a responsible person. Little Mendel thought in his heart. Franz naturally had no way of knowing the inner activities of the other party just now. At this time, he just wanted to change this awkward topic. After all, the university campus is a gathering place for all kinds of thoughts, and no matter what he heard, it was nothing unusual. Do you like mathematics? Franz asked. I like it very much, because mathematics is truth. Little Mendel replied without thinking. Very good. Please hold on. The empire needs a great mathematician to open the skylight and let people know what is the truth, rather than relative and uncertain theories created by people. Little Mendel nodded confusedly. Although he was not sure what Archduke Franz was referring to, it was definitely right to continue on the road of mathematics. That's good. If you have any difficulties, you can ask me for help. If you are interested, you can go to the Royal Society of Science to communicate more with those seniors. The so-called Royal Austrian Scientific Society at this time was more like a club, like a weekend salon, than a scientific organization. To put it simply, it is a platform for a group of academic leaders from various countries to communicate together. Everyone who can be invited is an expert in a certain field at this time. Of course, some exceptional participants were specially recommended by Franz. They are all figures who will leave mark in the history of human science in the future. So, when he handed the invitation letter from the Royal Society of Science to young Mendel, the latter felt extremely heavy. Yes. After hearing this, Franz just nodded politely, turned around and left. After taking a few steps, he turned around and said again, "I forgot to mention, occasionally you can also try to raise a few pots of green plants. For example, peas are very good." This sentence echoed in little Mendel's ears for a long time, making him puzzled. Why did the Grand Duke ask him to raise peas? On the carriage returning to Schönbrunn Palace, Jenny asked with some confusion, "That little fat guy just now? No, that young scholar just now. Is he really qualified to enter the Science Society?" "Ah, you talking about Mr. Mendel? I've seen it. His grades are indeed excellent and there are no problems," Franz said perfunctorily. "He is very powerful, but there are not even 1,000, but 800 people like him in Vienna." Seeing that Jenny seemed dissatisfied, Franz just spread his hands indifferently and said, "There are hundreds of smart people, but there is only one Mendel, but he is just a little known freshman who has just entered college. Just like Mr. Dobler, who you have been entrusting with important tasks, is just a less successful middle school teacher. Don't you know that many of your practices have confused some real authorities in the scientific community? They just don't dare to give you advice because of your status." Seeing Jenny's anxious and angry look, Franz couldn't help but laugh in his heart. What should be the standard for judging a scientist? Is it qualifications? Or age? No, neither. Miss Jenny, you should understand that blindly believing in authoritarianism is not a good phenomenon, and even I'm no exception. You actually know the dangers of authoritarianism. Chapter 265 Aunt's Visit. Jenny looked deeply hurt, which made Franz feel strange, because according to the latter's understanding, the former was a noble lady who lived and drank all day long before going into exile. How could she have anything to do with academic authority? Then, let me ask you, do you think I have 4 identities: warlord, Chibal, clan, and god? By the way, if you add a school clan, you will have all 5 poisons. Jenny naturally would not accept such a bomb, and she continued to elaborate on her previous point of view. You are now ordering a middle school teacher to lead a group of the best scholars in the entire Austrian Empire and even Europe to study some fantastic ideas that come out of nowhere. Isn't this authoritarianism? Franz scratched his head helplessly. He could not say that he was a time traveler. All these studies were the correct direction. That would be confirmed after 100 years. As for Doppler himself, he changed his research direction after 1848 and became the dean of the Vienna Academy of Physics immediately after becoming popular. It is a joke to say that such a person has no talent point, but Franz doesn't want a puppet who is willing to follow the crowd. He knows how scary things like learning valves can be. It was precisely because of the rise of Cheng Zhu Neo-Confucianism that the powerful ancient Eastern country was in a situation of circle on the outside and square on the inside. That is, weak and incompetent externally, cruel rule internally, and ideological confinement. The advantages that the rule is stable, but the disadvantage is that bad money drives out good money, which almost eliminates the possibility of a technological revolution, or the surrounding areas will be ruined together. Once academic authority reaches a certain level, it will produce a scale effect, that is, monopoly and exclusivity. At that time, the so-called academic and science will become sophistication. Just imagine what a terrible scene it would be if a group of people decided on some important research projects while changing glasses. Moreover, the reason why Franz would use an unfounded scholar like Doppler is because it is not easy to form gangs. Of course, if he really does not have that ability, then replace him. After all, the country's resources are limited. However, Franz will not change his views on people and things because of a few words from some people, even those who are very close to him. Stretch out your hand and let me see if you are taking advantage of me. Franz started looking for it from Ajani's hand. He felt that the other party must have received benefits from someone, otherwise how could he be interested in scientific research? Don't touch there, it's itchy, don't touch it. Ajani deliberately made some weird noises, which further confirmed Franz's conjecture, and the evidence must be on her body. In fact, in the palace, she had no worries about food and clothing, and there were not many things that could be bribed to Ajani. They were either rare jewelry or some products that transcended the times. Stop screaming. It's useless even if your throat is broken. There must be a secret in you. At this time, the car door was violently opened. In theory, no one would be a hero to save the beauty. After all, the people around him, from the coachman to the guards, were all Franz's people, and they were all used to it. A hand grasped Franz's ear, accompanied by Madame Sophie's voice. You kid, what are you going to do in broad daylight? Mother, listen to me. I am. Franz was interrupted by Mrs. Sophie before he finished speaking. You are innocent. She plotted against you. Franz nodded heavily after hearing this. Who are you lying to? Let's not say that you are more cunning than a fox in the forest. Just listening to what you just said, I know that your usual behavior must be very disorderly. Franz was speechless for a moment. He was just joking, but it was hard to believe it. Mrs. Sophie glanced at Ajani again, and the latter immediately straightened up. You too, what's your name? If you lose the royal family's face, can you afford it? It's me. Madame Sophie did not let Ajani finish her words, but raised her chin with a fan. I don't want to listen to those useless promises. Remember your own identity and mission. I don't want to say more about the rest. You know who I am, and I know who you are. Mrs. Sophie kissed Ajani gently on her neck, and then showed a meaningful smile. It's great that you are still so young and beautiful, mother. Why are you here? Franz interrupted the two of them, looking at each other. It's not because of you, because Franz asked with some confusion. Yes, your clothing factory has wiped out the entire German Confederation. Even your aunt's industry has suffered great losses. They have come to me to investigate. Mrs. Sophie looked very proud. Mother, haven't you always wanted to do this? There are so many aunts of mine. Which one are you talking about? Mrs. Sophie has 5 biological sisters and 3 half-sisters. Except for Aunt Ludovica, Princess Sis's mother, each of them married into a powerful kingdom. Grand Duke. When Franz was running a clothing factory, there were quite a few people who wanted to take over the job, including maybe 1 or 2 uncles and the like. Nothing big or small. Mrs. Sophie hit Franz on the head with her fan and continued. It's Aunt Maria Anna, now the Queen of Saxony. In 1836, Antoni, the self-proclaimed master of the most powerful state in North Germany, had left this world forever. The successor to the throne of Saxony was his nephew, Friedrich August I. After this man came to power, he immediately began to ease the situation with neighboring countries, especially the 2 powerful neighbors Austria and Prussia. At the same time, August II was also a king with strong liberalism, or he was more like a liberal bourgeoisie than a king. August II liked skiing, loved art, and even performed on stage himself. However, he was not a qualified monarch. He hated war, did not like fighting for hegemony, and was not even willing to fulfill the obligations of a king. He had no children in his life. August II announced the reduction of the army as soon as he came to power, and later became a patron of Vienna. Art is very expensive, and soon the Saxon government was heavily in debt. However, he did not care about this. Whenever ministers raised insufficient funds, August II would demand disarmament. After the army was reduced again and again, even the liberals who had always advocated disarmament began to be afraid, because the number of the army had been reduced from 80,000 at the peak of Antoni to 10,000. You must know that due to the influence of the railway at this time, the connections between the German states were greatly strengthened. Once a war broke out, Austria and Prussia could invade the Kingdom of Saxony in a very short period of time. At this time, Prussia had 200,000 troops, and could mobilize more than 500,000 troops within 3 months. The Austrian Empire has a standing army of 430,000 people, and there are 80,000 regular troops in Bohemia. Saxony alone. As a last resort, Saxon officials could only ask the queen to take charge of the situation. Franz's aunt was indeed a strong woman. She quickly took control of the kingdom's most profitable textile industry and nationalized it. Later, she imported new equipment from the Austrian Empire and signed a contract with the Kingdom of Hanover trade agreement to import British cotton. After a series of effective operations, the king's shortcomings in art were quickly filled, and he even had money to continue to expand the scale of the industry. Chapter 266 Agent. Franz's aunt had amazing ambitions, and it was not enough for her that Saxony became the largest cotton processor in North Germany. What she really wants is to surpass the Austrian Empire and become the textile industry hegemon in the German customs union. So simply expanding production capacity cannot satisfy her wishes. Of course, the Queen of Saxony made this decision after careful consideration and detailed investigation. Relying on her special relationship with the Kingdom of Hanover, she was able to purchase cheaper cotton raw materials, an advantage that other states in the German Confederation did not have. Although Austria has Egypt as an import channel, after the Turkish-Egyptian War, a large number of local cotton fields were ordered to be converted to grain, resulting in a significant reduction in its cotton output. Therefore, Austria has to turn its attention to Mexico and the United States. The former's cotton output has not increased due to years of war and the fact that the income from planting is far less than that of sugar and tobacco. As for the latter, the British have always followed the lead, which is also an important reason why the French must find a stable cotton source for themselves. Franz's aunt did not feel that the influence of the Austrian Empire on the North American continent could compete with France, so she did not choose to communicate with Mrs. Sophie when dealing with the market expansion led by the Austrian Empire. Because she was confident that she would be the final winner. She plunged into the competition for the clothing market. But then the US policy made a 180-degree turn, which dealt a huge blow to other countries in the German customs union. All countries and individuals who tried to compete with France for the market suffered heavy losses, and Saxony was naturally not immune. Everyone thought that the masterminds behind this operation were Franz's parents, but the Queen of Saxony was the twin sister of Lady Sophie, and their relationship was naturally unusual. So they never expected that they would be on the list of those who were deceived. When Queen Maria Anna learned the truth, she was ready to leave for Vienna immediately, trying to play the family card to help herself recover her losses. Mrs. Sophie felt that this was an opportunity to win over Saxony, an important northern ally of the Austrian Empire. Otherwise she would most likely send him away out of sympathy by giving him some money. Some people may think that Mrs. Sophie is ruthless in nature, and even the twin sisters are plotting against her. But in fact, when it comes to complex national interests, we must not think rashly in terms of human relationships, let alone judge based on simple closeness and distance. Schönbrunn Palace, Madame Sophie's palace. Franz finally met Mrs. Sophie's twin sister. The two had almost the same appearance and figure, but this aunt seemed to be 10 years older than his mother. The skin on her face is sagging, and wrinkles are visible, just like those of housewives who work hard all day long. Hello, Aunt Maria. Hello, Franz. I haven't seen you for a few years, but you've grown so tall. You are still beautiful, Aunt Maria. In fact, Franz did not lie. Women in this era age very quickly, and Aunt Maria is already considered beautiful among women of her age. Hey, time is not forgiving. Unlike your mother, who doesn't have to worry about anything, even though she married a husband who doesn't care about anything, she gave birth to a capable son. What a blessing. Alright, Maria, let's get down to business. If you continue to go around, you will be stunned by this brat. Mrs. Sophie reminded. Okay, Sophie, I'll get to the point. Franz, my aunt lost 6 million florins this time, and I need you to make up for it. Isn't it 3 million? Mrs. Sophie said in surprise. Don't. I want to test whether your son is stupid. Queen Maria Anna said with a hint of sarcasm. Archduke Franz Karol is a recognized idiot. Franz, then just do what aunt said and give her 6 million. Let this person who has never laid an egg be envious. Naturally, Mrs. Sophie would not let her sister go. Then, You laid so many eggs, why don't you give me one, and I want Maximilian. Queen Maria Anna said half-jokingly. However, this kind of thing is not uncommon among European royal families. Mrs. Sophie actually hopes that at least each of her children will have a crown, so she is seriously considering this matter. Why? Because the color of this egg is different. Queen Maria Anna laughed. All the Franz family have chestnut hair, and only Maximilian has black hair, so he is often talked about behind his back. You dare to say anything? You want to die? Mrs. Sophie strangled Queen Maria Anna's neck, and the latter could only beg for mercy. Aunt Maria, do you think this is good? My family's clothing factory places an order for 600,000 spindles of cotton cloth from Saxony every year. Franz spoke easily, but Queen Maria Anna's eyes widened, because the amount of cotton processed in Saxony was only 600,000 spindles a year. And don't forget that it is the country with the most developed textile industry in North Germany, she said with some disbelief. Is this real? Of course it's false. Mrs. Sophie was still resentful of what her sister had said before, and now was a good opportunity for revenge. It's so bad. I lied to you. This little brat Franz is always serious when he speaks, although he often sounds like he is bragging. The relationship between Mrs. Sophie and her twin sisters is still very good, and there are no outsiders in her bedroom, so the conversation can naturally be more open. But I have a condition. The price of Saxon cotton must be consistent with the Austrian Empire. Franz's words did not surprise Queen Maria Anna. After all, such great luck would be almost impossible without any additional conditions. Of course there is no problem. The top leaders of Saxony, including my husband, have long lost their pioneering spirit. Now liberal thoughts are rampant in the country, and the mob is ready to revolt and overthrow the country together with my husband. But our police and soldiers are unemployed. I'm trying my best to win over those powerful people, but they only know how to fight for power and gain, and the whole country is in chaos. The businessmen have already defected to foreign forces, and the country of Saxony is hopeless. It can be seen that this queen is really tired from her life. Franz glanced at Madame Sophie, who nodded, and the former withdrew from the room. Don't bow your head. The crown will fall. Don't shed tears. The bitch will laugh. You are the Queen of Saxony. There is nothing to be afraid of. Believe me. At least you have me as a solid ally to back you up. Madame Sophie suddenly remembered what Franz had said, and found it interesting, so she used it. But these words sounded completely different to Maria Anna's ears, and they instantly made her feel that her image as a sister was much taller. Sophie, you know, the Queen of Saxony doesn't have much power. I can only do things within the scope of my power. Unlike you, dear Maria, I'm just a princess. Everything depends on people. If you lose your confidence, no one can save you. If your husband can't do it, then keep the power firmly in your own hands. As a barrier between Austria and Prussia, a two-weak Saxony is not a good thing, because once it weakens, it will intensify the contradiction between the northern and southern giants at the same time. It will also greatly enhance Prussia's influence in North Germany, which is not what the Austrian Empire wants to see. As for Hanover, which seems to be powerful, it is actually heading for destruction step by step. It is more difficult than ever to rely on a group of second-rate dealers to create obstacles for Prussia. Affected by the German customs union, the countries that joined the union were experiencing a golden period of rapid development, and it was only a matter of time before Hanover, a country that relied heavily on British goods, would decline. Saxony was an important pawn used by the Austrian Empire to counter Prussia. If Austria went directly to suppress Prussia, it would most likely arouse the anger of Protestants throughout North Germany. Moreover, Britain, France, and Russia will not sit back and let them unify Germany, so proxy war is a good choice at this time. Chapter 267 Napoleon's funeral. On December 15, 1840, Napoleon Bonaparte once again landed on French soil, and this time the French welcomed his return very enthusiastically. The streets were empty and the shops were closed. An old lady passed by. She felt that Paris was like a bottle of wine tilted and poured on one side of the city. The wind was biting, the sun was shining brightly, the fog was shrouded, and the ditches were covered with ice. The sky was covered with dark clouds, and patches of north wind passed through the gaps at this time. People on St. Andre Street seemed to be caught up in festive madness. If you pay attention, you can still see some poor workers in shabby clothes, standing shivering in the cold wind, but their faces are filled with excitement from the bottom of their hearts. They waved their arms wildly and shouted, "Your Majesty, point there." Streets were lined with young women, splendid working women, and playboys from the University of Paris. They were weaving in and out of the crowd, as if they were at a party. The sky was dark, and the snowflakes were like white teardrops, flying in the air, as if God was also showing its mercy. A heavy, rhythmic banging sound appeared at the end of the street, as thousands of spectators waited for the funeral procession to pass on the high stands on both sides of the street. Noble men and women were wrapped in scarves or scarves, huddled in fur coats with expressionless faces. After a while, 2 rows of elite soldiers riding tall horses and equipped with bright equipment solemnly appeared. They were the military police units of the same district and the vanguard of the funeral procession. What appeared next were the gorgeously dressed light cavalry and cuirassiers. The brass helmets and silver-white breastplates on their heads undoubtedly symbolized the glory of the past, as if the time had returned to more than 20 years ago. What came into view next were the generals riding tall horses, with dazzling ribbons and shining medals hanging on their chests, accompanied by riflemen on their sides. Behind them is an infantry array composed of military school students. Although their chests are blank, their heads are held higher than anyone else, because they are the best elites in this country's military schools. Napoleon once again returned to his loyal Paris, and many people shed tears of excitement as the procession passed through the Arc de Triomphe. What greeted him were the once loyal old guards. At this time, they were already the old guards in the true sense. Most of the veterans who had participated in the Napoleonic Wars were already in their 60s at this time. These old people, who usually needed help when walking, straightened their backs at this time, just like when they were inspected by the emperor before going off to war. It's just that the great man could not stand up again and lead them to conquer Europe. The onlookers were whispering, because the person responsible for escorting Napoleon's body was Prince Joinville of the July dynasty. He looked very proud, as if he was a victor returning with trophies. This is obviously not a scene that Napoleonists want to see, but at this time, any drastic action will be counterproductive and even bring shame to the name Napoleon, so they can only watch the July dynasty drain that great man dry. The last bit of value. Suddenly the snow in the sky became heavier, and the dark sky highlighted the gloomy and cold weather. And everyone on both sides of the street became solemn and solemn. Unknowingly, Prince Joinville also felt the pressure and couldn't help but feel his throat tightening. He unconsciously pulled his collar outward with his hands so that he could breathe smoothly. Louis Philippe got up very early. He stood on the steps in the center of the Hall of l'Invalides on the Seine, looking at the dark crowd in front of him. He also felt tremendous pressure. Damn, Napoleon, you are already a dead man. France is mine. Louis Philippe suppressed the anger in his heart. Everyone thinks that Louis Philippe is an incompetent and cowardly person, and even a fool who can be bullied personally. Whether they mock his painter, humiliate his Jews, compare him to the Orthodox grocer, or laugh at him, weak liberals all thought this guy would never get angry. But in reality, Louis Philippe was never soft on those who coveted his power. When the hearse containing Napoleon's remains arrived at the gate of Les Invalides, Louis Philippe led French civil and military officials to wait at the gate of honor. Everyone was covered with medals and ribbons. Countless journalists and writers employed by the French government. The painter is recording this historic moment. Those gorgeous ribbons and expensive medals made of gold and silver looked him in front of the 2,600 kilograms of military flags tied around the coffin. These military flags are Napoleon's trophies, and they also tell the glory of an era, and its name is Napoleon. Joinville, the son of Louis Philippe, dismounted and walked towards Louis Philippe, saluted a straight military salute and said, "I am commissioned by the Emperor of France, Louis Philippe, to present to you the remains of the Emperor Napoleon." Louis Philippe raised his head high and solemnly swore, "I accept him in the name of France." At this time, the atmosphere team that had been prepared began to build momentum for Louis Philippe, with thunderous applause, flowers, and snowflakes flying in the sky. The sounds of cannons and fireworks explosions intertwined, filling the joyful atmosphere. Before the burial, Louis Philippe deliberately asked everyone to pay homage to Napoleon's body again. He hoped that the Bonapartists would give up their illusions. When they saw the pile of rotten flesh point, when the coffin was opened, those who came to see Emperor Napoleon's final appearance were all stunned on the spot. Louis Philippe was very satisfied with the expressions of these people, looking at the disillusionment in their hearts. And when he looked back, he saw that the body was intact, as if he had just fallen asleep. He staggered in fright and almost fell to the ground. His mind was blank at the moment, and he had no idea whether this was Napoleon's conspiracy or a damn British prank. Louis Philippe fled Les Invalides in panic, and told his most capable men to ensure that the Corsican could not leave. The newly appointed spy chief, the Duke of Marchaux, did not know the reason, but still ordered the closure of the Invalides, in order to prevent someone from destroying the remains. The next day, Louis Philippe issued a series of incredible orders, which was to seal Napoleon's coffin with 2 tons of brass, and then press a 35-ton marble statue on top. No one knew why, only a frightened king huddled in bed in the Tuileries Palace. I won't go into details about the reasons, so as not to talk about hydrology. The reason was that the arsenic content in Napoleon's body exceeded the legal limit. At this time, Louis Bonaparte was unable to attend his uncle's funeral because he was singing Tears Behind Bars while writing a book called The Abolition of Poverty in Arkham Prison. Here Louis Napoleon met many new friends, such as a clever clown who is both good and evil, the mysterious killer Goo from the East, and the violent sheriff Frank Miller. We have to share everything together. The Bellera brothers, and Victor Hugo, who was imprisoned for satirizing the church. If anyone likes to read here, I will expand on it later. If there are many objections, then just treat it as a joke. In France, the rumor that Napoleon is still alive is widely spread, but Napoleon's surviving brothers firmly deny this, and the Bonapartists can only find other ways. Chapter 268 Some troubles at AOMEX United Development Company, Vienna, Schönbrunn Palace. Franz was engrossed in reading several letters from California. It clearly reads, after all the hard work, Baron Bruno finally found several huge gold veins. According to conservative estimates, the total amount is more than 1 million ounces, equivalent to 38,834,500 florins. Putting down the letter in his hand, Franz leaned on his chair and breathed. It seems that the geology of this era is unreliable. Even the most conservative estimates of later generations show that the total gold mine volume in California is more than 12 million ounces. Most experts' estimates are between 20 million ounces and 30 million ounces between. In fact, this kind of open pit gold mine is easy to discover. As for whether it is easy to estimate, Franz doesn't know. However, in this era of scarcity of precious metals, it is human nature to have insufficient control. Of course, that is just his most malicious guess. If the gold mines here were dug out, it should be enough to pay off the debts of the Austrian Empire. But Franz didn't really want to do this. After all, why should he pay back the debt he owed, based on his ability? Of course, the main reason is that there are a large number of loan sharks in these debts. In some cases, the total principal and interest has even doubled dozens or even hundreds of times over the years. Through Baron Bruno's unremitting efforts, he has reached an agreement with his creditors. Otherwise, Franz plans to kill all the guys who are overfed. Coincidentally, during the previous internal strife in Hungary, the empire received the corpses of another batch of creditors, so its overall debt dropped directly by more than 200 million florins. Franz had asked someone to do a rough calculation, and found that, as long as creditors with serious anti-Austrian tendencies disappeared from the world, the empire's debt level would be reduced by 60%. Although it would be fun to do so, what you are doing is just repeating the same choices made by countless predecessors in parallel worlds. To truly break the cycle of reincarnation, Franz must take a path that no one has ever traveled before. Of course, this road will be difficult, perhaps more difficult than realizing the ambitions of the Habsburg royal family, but he does not intend to back down. On the other hand, Baron Bruno also brought bad news. That is, the Mexicans did not keep their promises. While they turned a blind eye, a large number of American pioneers poured into California. Although it has not yet formed a large scale, it will definitely become a big trouble here in the long run. It is not difficult to imagine the next scene. Once they have established a foothold, they will compete with the local Austrian immigrants for land and resources. Once they discover the secret of the gold mine, the consequences will be disastrous. This land will definitely become the object of fierce competition among major powers such as Britain and France. By that time, not only will it be unable to fulfill its promise to Mexico, but it will even be unable to recover the costs that the empire has invested over the years. The New Mexico defense line, built under the leadership of Tazanana, was like a colander. The two neighboring countries in the north can always move in and out easily, allowing them to clearly understand the true strength of their southern neighbor. It's just that France and the United States are intimidated by each other's strength and dare not invade Mexico easily unless God tells them in a dream tomorrow that there is a gold mine in California. In this regard, Franz could only sigh with emotion. It's really impossible to hold up the wall with mud. Also, immigrating to California were Spanish laborers, most of whom were refugees from the Civil War. These people had just arrived and were not familiar with their identities. Not only did they look down on the local Mexicans and indigenous people, they even planned riots in some settlements to overthrow the rule of the Mexican United Company. However, they were quickly suppressed by Austrian soldiers organized in time by Archduke Karl Ferdinand. In addition to the 500 retired soldiers recruited by France from various places, there were also 200 elite guards of Archduke Karol who followed the Great Justice. It was precisely because of the existence of these people that the laborers who participated in the riot paid a heavy price. A terrible price. Those who came to California to start new jobs, to escape the war, did not know how to be grateful. Instead, they believed that they should be the rightful owners of this former Spanish colony. Under the deliberate instigation of local Hispanics, they either fled or participated in the rebellion. In the largest riot, the number of people killed alone reached 3,700. Due to the language barrier and the depth of the wilderness, the local Austrian soldiers showed no mercy. Archduke Karl Ferdinand is different from his brother, who is full of honor and who advocates force. He just wants to complete his mission and is a truly ruthless killing machine. Regardless of whether they are participants or facilitators, regardless of whether they are men, women, old or young, as long as they participate in the rebellion, they will all end up dead. Even the instigators who hide in the village and think everything is fine are not immune. Although this approach is cruel, it is effective in the western region where natural selection and survival of the fittest prevail. Moreover, the number of local Austrians is at an absolute disadvantage. If they stand aside and watch the other party's forces twist into a rope, they will be the ones who are treated cruelly. After reducing the local population of 4,000 households to 1,000, the situation gradually stabilized. However, after nearly 2 years of development, the local Mexican population has not increased, but has declined significantly. Austria's population increased from 700 to 4,000. The number of indigenous people dropped from 20,000 to 8,000, and of the 20,000 Spanish workers introduced, only 3,000 remained at this time. At this time, there were only about 15,000 white settlers in the entire 563,970 square kilometers of California, which means that on average, you can meet one person within 39.59 square kilometers. This gave pioneers from the United States and France a great opportunity, because not only the number of Austrian immigrants was limited, but also enough militiamen needed to be trained and deployed to guard their homes, and the available manpower was really stretched. At the same time, finding and identifying intruders on the vast plains cannot be accomplished overnight. What's even more fatal is that Mexico is an unreliable partner. They have no intention of contributing, and relying solely on the numerically disadvantaged Austrian immigrants cannot solve the current difficulties. So Baron Bruno wrote several letters to Archduke Franz Karol, hoping that he could find a way to help them get out of their predicament. To be honest, it was quite tricky to deal with this matter. Franz originally hoped that the Mexicans could be the black gloves, but what he didn't expect was that Austria actually took the blame. But there is nothing that can be done about it. The wilderness has its own laws, and if you try to violate them, you will definitely suffer backlash. If the first 700 Austrians did not rise up to resist, they would have become a pile of bones by now. In fact, it is not difficult to find a few hundred people who understand Spanish from within the empire, but if the number expands to tens of thousands, even Austria, a big language country, cannot do this. The reason why the Spanish laborers resisted so fiercely has a lot to do with the long-term national characteristics, inherent concepts, and prejudices. During this period, Europeans looked down on Americans. In addition, Mexico was once a Spanish colony, so these Hispanic immigrants believed that they were superior people from the mother country. Another point is the national identity. After all, the empires that tried to conquer Spain all declined without exception. Neither the Berbers, who were at their peak, nor the arrogant Napoleonic Empire could conquer the Spaniards, and with the end of the Carlist War, fewer and fewer people are willing to come to the New World, so Franz's plan A should have failed. Fortunately, he is not a person who likes stud, so it is always good to have a few backup plans at this time. Franz set his sights on another place on the map, the Central American Federation. The Civil Wars in Central America significantly escalated in intensity as the French became increasingly involved, and the land was also inhabited by Spanish-speaking people. And most of them are of mixed race. These people's self-esteem is not as strong as the Spaniards, and they are more able to endure hardships. At the same time, they are smaller and easier to rule. Regarding the title, many people felt that the title could not express the complete content, so they lengthened the title. Thanks to recent book friends Dimensional Namba Zia, Zio Shenda, The Strongest Kindergarten Small Class, S Yundang Bathing, and book friends 20221014001131-91 for their awards. Chapter 269 The Careless Mexico, Mexico City. After Tazanana learned the news that Napoleon's body had returned to China, he was even very excited and said that he would go to Paris in person to see the idol for the last time. In order to prevent him from acting recklessly, Diego, a former black slave, Jimmy, an American traitor, and Martin, an Indian leader, could only hold his thigh tightly to prevent him from falling into the trap. After all, the French have always coveted the land of this former Spanish colony. If the president, who is the only one who can control the situation, is killed or kidnapped in France, it will be terrible for this unstable country. Under the guidance of economic advisors sent by Austria, the Mexicans have made great progress in their mining and agriculture industries, but their factories cannot recruit people, and the machines purchased from Austria have been put aside because the local people prefer to use native methods, and it was impossible for France to send a large number of skilled workers to Mexico thousands of miles away, because these people were still in need even in Austria. On the other hand, the locals were afraid that their jobs would be taken away by the newly introduced machines. They not only united to boycott the existing factories, but also opposed any new plans. This has slowed the development of Mexico's sugar industry, and at the same time, the military industry has almost stagnated. Compared with sugar factories, military factories require more high quality talents, and Mexico obviously does not have this condition. Of course, this is within Franz's plan. Austria can provide a group of talents to help Mexico develop its military industry, but the cost will naturally be higher, but it is not worth mentioning compared to the cost of independent development. However, the establishment of the arsenal was strongly opposed by domestic factions and local forces in Mexico. Each family hoped that the arsenal would be established on its own territory. After all, in Mexico, more often than not, whoever has the biggest fist has the final say. Finally, several major families in Mexico united to resist the establishment of the arsenal, and Tazanana himself acquiesced in the matter. There are also Tazanana's own considerations here. Building an arsenal in Mexico is certainly a good thing for the country, but it will affect the interests of many families after all, whose territory it is built on will have greater say in the future, which will obviously break the balance of power in the country. Even if it is built on one's own territory, it will be feared by other families. Therefore, instead of risking a civil war, it is better to rely on the convenience of importing weapons from abroad. To be fair, Tassiana has eliminated at least a dozen armed forces that opposed him over the years, but domestic rebellions still emerge and endlessly. What saddened him the most was that the mistress Miss Jenny, who had been following him, turned out to be a spy sent by the Americans. The United Development Company of Mexico and Mexico pays about 21 million florins to the Mexican government every year, accounting for almost 1/3 of Mexico's total fiscal revenue. But even though the Austrians are still giving blood transfusions to Mexico, they still cannot make this country in internal chaos fundamentally improve. For example, the New Mexico defense line boasted by Tassiana not long ago is ineffective. Its domestic political situation is still divided. Local separatist forces continue to rely on the mines under his rule to make blood, and the government army often has to sell its own weapons in exchange for funds. Although Tassiana is not a competent leader, the situation may only get worse with another person. The curse of Mexico is that it sits on countless mineral resources and countless fertile lands. Even local forces without silver mines can obtain large amounts of funds through other minerals or the trade of growing tobacco and cane sugar, and then build their own private kingdoms locally. In the inherent impression of many people, the hard currency Mexico relies on for trade is only silver mines. In fact, its mineral reserves are very rich. Among them, the export volume of copper ranks second in the world, and the export volume of sugar and tobacco also ranks among the top 3 in the world. But precisely because of this, Mexico has become a piece of walking fat in the eyes of the great powers. Historically, Mexico has allowed its northern neighbors to successfully carve off a vast territory, and it has never recovered since. In order to truly end Mexico's long-standing chronic disease, the ongoing civil war, it is not enough to eradicate local separatist forces. It is also necessary to uproot some systems that hinder the country's progress to truly eliminate the disease. However, hundreds of years of colonial abuse cannot be easily eliminated, and it is simply impossible to complete this arduous task in a short time. In order to prevent Mexico from being annexed by its 2 powerful neighbors to the north, France had to continue to give it blood transfusions. Of course, this was not a bad thing for the Austrian Empire. After all, the Austrian-Mexican Joint Development Company can still earn 9 million florins in profits for Austria every year. At the same time, after the gold mines in California are mined, they can also provide the empire with countless wealth. During this period, the capable Baron Bruno will try his best to establish a complete system in the local area to collect the wool of gold diggers in the future. The land of sunlight isn't just famous for its gold mines. It was also the most agriculturally developed state in the United States in later generations, producing crops including cotton, wheat, corn, and rice. In addition, it also has a large area of arable land with good natural conditions and a large amount of high-quality pasture for the development of animal husbandry. Although its overall mineral resource reserves are not as good as those of the Great Lakes region, they are still among the top in the world. In addition, the land of sunlight also has an excellent fishing ground formed by the intersection of the California cold current and the equatorial countercurrent. Although it is not one of the 4 largest fishing grounds in the world, it can still provide a large amount of fishery resources. At least for now, its output is sufficient to meet its own needs and for export. Even if California were considered just a colony, it was one of the top colonies in the world. However, since the Panama Canal had not yet been opened at this time, it was difficult for the Austrian Empire to communicate with it, so it could only settle for the next best thing. It was not difficult to introduce workers from Central America. Due to the impact of the war, a large number of ordinary people were willing to sell themselves into slavery. Although Mexico's top leaders are interested in annexing the Central American Federation, its people do not like the residents living there. For example, many refugees who fled to Mexico to escape civil strife were brutally killed, and even survivors could not escape the fate of becoming slaves. Let me mention here that, although the Mexican government explicitly prohibits any form of slavery, the implementation standards vary in different regions. But precisely because of the backing of this anti-slavery law and the Emancipators' Proclamation, Franz's letter to Tazanana, the ethnic minorities in Mexico, are very supportive of the current government and its black residents. Everyone has a fanatical admiration for the president personally. Point of course, Tazanana was not just talking nonsense, he also set an example. At least in front of him, no one dared to point fingers at his black soldiers or Indian staff officers, and the traitor Jimmy, who once belonged to the Texas Army, used torture on enemies and traitors time and time again to prove his loyalty to Mexico. Point of course, no one knows the real reason why this skinning butcher stayed in Mexico, whether it was out of personal loyalty to Tazanana or an extreme personal hobby. Point the reason why the Indians like Tazanana is that he is the first white leader in hundreds of years to truly abide by the agreement signed with them. Point. Although the Mexican government is unwilling to send troops to protect Austrian immigrants in California, it has always given a green light to the approval of its various policies and documents relying on this relationship. Baron Bruno easily met Tazanana. When the latter learned that the god of wealth was coming, he naturally kept asking after him and said that he could choose any brothel in Mexico City as they were all government properties, and it was just his decision. Baron Bruno first explained his intention. He said that the company planned to import Central American labor to supplement the lack of labor. Naturally, Tazanana would not stop him. He signed a special presidential decree on the spot and promised that Mexico would send troops to escort him. At this time, the Baron seemed to have thought of something again. Although he was a little embarrassed to speak, he still spoke for the long-term peace and stability of California. Is it true that you just said that I can choose any brothel in Mexico City? Yes, Baron. I'm not bragging. Here is the best service in the entire North American continent, and you will definitely be satisfied. Tazanana said with some pride. This is so good. I wish we could move both brothels to California. Tazanana was surprised and speechless for a moment after hearing this, but then he understood what the other party meant. That's no problem, but these are our national industries in Mexico. Please tell your subordinates and ask them not to forget to pay taxes. Deal. Mr. President. Chapter 270. A few things about pilot education. At this time, several missionary schools in Tyrol had been open for nearly 3 years. As the number of schools increased, the problems exposed became more and more obvious. Because of religious beliefs, the church has irreplaceable appeal in the local area. Coupled with the vigorous publicity by local government agencies, especially highlighting the free nature, it attracted the attention of a large number of poor people. The educational work carried out in Tyrol at the beginning can be described as hot, which can be seen from the various people who filled the various missionary schools, but soon a series of problems emerged. The first was the uneven quality of this group of educated people. Some people even chose to receive education only because they could earn a living. In order to do its best to educate more Tyrolean mountain people, the church added many welfare measures to the school's outline, such as no age limit for enrollees and free lunches, etc. This was also based on Franz's suggestions. But it is precisely because of this that some guys who are greedy for petty gains came up with the idea of harvesting wool. Soon, after their processing and exaggerated descriptions, they spread the word from 1 to 10 and spread it to hundreds, causing many Tyroleans to be bewitched. He also became a member of the army of food lovers. Soon the church was forced to introduce new rules and regulations to strictly guard against these speculators, who only came to the school for the purpose of making money. To be fair, free lunches are very attractive to mountain people who are struggling to make ends meet, so they cannot be rashly classified as speculators. But it is true that some of them only focus on the free food and do not want to study in school. They take advantage of the school's initial provision of unlimited food to make profits for themselves, and even bring sacks and baskets with them every time for the convenience of transportation. These people bring a large amount of food home almost every day to feed pigs and use as fertilizer. Some people who don't know how to cherish it even throw it away on the roadside and let it rot. This forced the church to make changes and promulgated new measures such as no food can be taken out of the school, 1 free lunch per person, and no one will be allowed to receive it if the class is less than 4 periods a day. As a result, within a month of the new regulations being introduced, 3 schools were set on fire, more than 100 faculty and staff were beaten or abused, and 11 priests were tortured to death. This time, the church joined forces with the Tyrolean government and the army, and vowed to catch all the thugs who caused the trouble. However, the local people were fierce. Instead of arresting a few thugs, the military police lost nearly 100 people, including several excellent hunters. Moreover, this operation also caused a negative consequence, that is, the vigilant mountain residents no longer stepped into the school gate, and the students who really wanted to learn knowledge also disappeared. For a time, the front doors of these missionary schools changed from crowded to deserted. Finally, Franz, who learned of the situation, had to write to the local defense force headquarters in Tyrol to ask for help in resolving the crisis. In view of the lofty status of the royal family in the hearts of the Tyroleans, the matter went very smoothly, and soon more than 100 thugs were detained on Innsbruck's Golden Square. Innsbruck is the capital of Tyrol and the former capital of the Austrian Empire. In fact, according to the church's own records, the real number of thugs was far higher than this number. But Franz ignored him, because he didn't want to retaliate at all. If these mountain people could really be frightened by hundreds of corpses, so many great conquerors would not have troubled themselves with this problem. Archbishop Prussia went to Innsbruck in the early stage and read out the emperor's edict. The principle was naturally to kill only the culprits and never ask questions about threats. Soon the 5 initiators of the atrocity were sentenced to hanging and executed immediately. Before their death, the thugs sincerely carried out the priest's request for repentance. However, this did not serve as a warning to others, and soon the same evil incident occurred again. Only then did Franz understand that the traditional regret plus punishment model did not seem to work well. So in the end, he had to use Archbishop Prussia to have the royal flag planted on the local church school, and also ordered the local garrison to guard it, so that the atrocities could be quelled. After that, the church once again issued the rule that adults are not allowed to enroll in the church's schools for minors. At the same time, a number of specialized adult schools were opened in the Tyrol region. Although education was still free on the surface, the free lunches were cancelled. Naturally, it was difficult to attract people. In the end, most of these schools were closed. Forced to close. Who would have thought that it would be difficult to eliminate some of the local snakes who led the trouble, but new problems followed one after another. That is the weak educational concept of local people. It's okay for city dwellers like Innsbruck, but in the countryside, especially in the mountains, it's a different scene. Some villages don't even have a single person who has read a book, so naturally they don't understand the true meaning of going to school. In the eyes of these country children, as long as they can earn a living, they will actively set an example with practical actions. Under the guidance of this idea, rural students who come to class are very attentive to handicraft classes, and they will make handicrafts with an extremely serious attitude. This made the teachers who wanted to use handicraft classes to promote education dumbfounded. These simple children made them both moved and helpless in order to change the local backward thinking. Franz hoped that Archbishop Prussia could mobilize local priests to educate the local people by telling stories and giving examples. However, the real problem is that the residences of these mountain people are often very remote, and it is very inconvenient to get around. Those local priests who have long been accustomed to it can still accept it, but the priests selected from other areas would rather take off their robes and go into the ravine every day. This resulted in diminishing incentives throughout the Diocese of Tyrol to maintain local parochial schools, until one day Archbishop Prussia doubled the salaries of those priests involved in educational work. In fact, it should be called clergy allowance, but some people may find it unintuitive. The income of the clergy directly reached the level of 3 times the local average salary. If the goals set by the church can be achieved, another reward equivalent to the local average salary will be given. Sure enough, there must be brave men under the heavy rewards. Those priests instantly turned into God's apostles who were not afraid of hardships and dangers, traveling over mountains and ridges, teaching people tirelessly. To be fair, priests are not all greedy for money. It's just that after the clergy allowance was increased, They felt that they were respected and were more willing to fulfill their vows. However, this also brings about a problem. That is, the cost of education becomes higher at the same time. The unemployed college students Franz recruited from Vienna began to protest publicly because they felt they were being left out. They claimed that it was unreasonable for priests with less academic qualifications to receive much higher salaries than they did. In fact, the wages of these people are 50% higher than the local average. However, because they were accustomed to the prosperity of the imperial capital, the sense of gap caused by being suddenly sent to teach in Tyrol was difficult for them to accept for a while. So Franz gave this group of people the same promise. They could also engage in the work of priests and get the same remuneration as long as they met or reached the same level. But most of this group of people did not buy it. They always compared the living standards of Vienna with Tyrol, one of the poorest provinces in Austria. Then Franz could only fire those who were not satisfied with the status quo. In fact, if they are only engaged in basic education work, the level of these non-education major college students may not be as good as those of priests who have been exposed to all kinds of people all year round. Of course, the upper limit of these college students is higher than that of the clergy, so Franz provides them with a lot of room for advancement, such as some public offices that are neither salty nor light. Regardless of salary and benefits, public employment had an unparalleled attraction for college students at that time. This special status can greatly satisfy the vanity of those people. And Franz himself is happy to do this because he can recruit more talents after a lot of practice. Many deficiencies in Tyrol's church schools have been improved, including school rules and disciplines, as well as publicity and education. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 271. A few things about pilot education. Compared with Tyrol, the education popularization work carried out in Schindler region is much smoother. Due to the cultural gap between the East and the West, local people regard education as a gift. Because this kind of treatment has been monopolized by the wealthy families in Schindler since ancient times, it is understandable that they are excited at this moment. In view of the large number of people in the Schindler area, the church had no choice but to select or draw lots to determine who had the opportunity to receive education. According to the final results, most of the first batch of Schindler people who were given this opportunity were religious fanatics and children of members of the Sciterii. Previously, it was with the help of the Austrian church that the Vietnamese and Siamese invaders were able to be driven away. The entire territory of Schindler was liberated, and the exploitation of local nobles was greatly reduced. Moreover, the various technologies brought over have greatly liberated local productivity and even saved the royal family. Therefore, the vast majority of Schindler people have a fanatical worship of the church, and of course the missionaries are indispensable for leading this enthusiasm. After all, this is also an old trick of the Spaniards. The so-called learning and application is not the case. And this time, the missionaries learned and summarized the experiences and lessons of their predecessors, and did not directly seek the golden land like the general colonists. Although many schools were built temporarily, they were meticulously arranged, and the surrounding walls and ceilings were inlaid with murals with strong religious themes. The church spreads knowledge in the name of the gospel of God, and learning Austrian is the way to obtain the gospel. In addition, local officials in Schindler also ordered school students to kneel to listen to lectures, because this can show respect for the gospel of God. On the other side of the classroom were the senior staff of the Sciterii, holding wooden rulers and rattan sticks. They accompanied the missionaries in class. These servants of God felt helpless as they looked at the young men kneeling neatly on the ground. They preferred that the locals could sit in class, but they were opposed by the Sciterii and the Schindler people, elects, who were the first to attach themselves to the church, because the latter believed that not kneeling was not enough to show their piety to God. Finally, under the insistence of the missionaries, a cushion was added under the knees of the teenagers, but their bodies still maintained their kneeling posture. As for the discipline during class, it was so good that it was shameful, because anyone who dozed off skipped class, made trouble, or answered questions incorrectly would be severely beaten by the soldiers of the Sciterii. They ranged from being punched and kicked to being beaten to a bloody pulp by a rattan ruler. The person who beat someone was most likely the child's parents or clan leader. The reason for this situation is that the Chenla people combined the actual local conditions and the church's electorate theory to develop a system similar to the Indian caste system. As long as they are fair-skinned, speak Austrian, and understand religion, their status will rise. The group of slaves rescued when the church first arrived in Kampong Saman. Those who directly converted to Catholicism were called the elected people. The nobles, landowners, and businessmen who later defected to the church were called first-class citizens. Civilians further down are called second-class citizens. Those who do not believe in religion are called abandoned people. Archbishop Prussia followed Franz's suggestion and implemented an assessment system locally. The requirements for voters were particularly strict, so the parents and patriarchs who were voters monitored the teaching situation so frantically. The area directly controlled by the church in Chenla has a population of about 3 million, but the number of voters is only about 20,000, of which 3,000 are members of the Sciterii. They actually occupy almost all senior official positions in the army and military police. The most powerful group of people besides church missionaries after that are those former Zenla elites at first. These people were not convinced by this system and even raised troops to resist. However, the unparalleled gap in military strength between the two sides finally dashed their hopes and illusions. Not to mention these Chenla people, even the Vietnamese who once conquered them were vulnerable to the Sciterii. Therefore, after the test of several wars, this system has become more stable. In fact, in the eyes of the church, there are only distinctions between elected people, common people, and abandoned people. All civilians who want to become voters must pass an assessment or make a contribution. Of course, the specific selection criteria are naturally controlled by the church. After the children of voters are born, they will not directly inherit the identity of their parents, but will also have to undergo assessment or make contributions to prove that they are qualified to become voters. In addition, children of voters who have sacrificed for the church or made great contributions can also directly obtain voter status, and this is also the most fundamental reason why those Chenla people are so crazy about receiving education. However, this is not without its advantages. That is, the Austrianization of the upper strata of Chenla has become extremely rapid. Another point is that the living standards of the people in the clerical areas of Chenla and the non-clerical areas are very different. Under the leadership of the church, the ecclesiastical district actively carried out the construction of water conservancy, adopted a more reasonable farming system, and researched and used new agricultural tools and fertilizers. At the same time, there were a large number of iron tools smelted from Siam, including agricultural tools, knives, and miscellaneous items. The non-clerical areas are still in a very primitive agricultural civilization. They were extremely short of iron tools, and their level of technological development was extremely low. They even regressed due to some special reasons. Their actual level was not as good as that of the Tang dynasty. This huge contrast makes the people of the diocesan believe even more in the so-called electorate theory. In addition, the dedication theory helped the church successfully seize a large amount of wealth in the Chenla area, most of which was shipped back to Austria. But even a small amount invested in improving the colonial environment transformed the country. In just a few years, the influence of the Chenla royal family was swallowed up by the church. Even those local forces that clung to their rights without letting go became confused and frightened under the impact of the industrial country's dimensionality reduction. Of course, the church did not rush to convert those non-clerical areas into ecclesiastical areas. Instead, under Franz's suggestion, it adopted a strategy of gradual encroachment. Coming from a later generation, he always felt that nothing was more important than a solid foundation, so cultivating more spiritual Austrians and pro-Austrian elite groups was a top priority. Just as the plan to integrate Chenla was gradually moving steadily along the normal track, the Gallic rooster also began to act unwillingly. In fact, Not long ago, Archbishop Prussia had noticed some actions of the French in Vietnam, and their goal was undoubtedly to conquer their point at the same time, because the Kingdom of Siam did not take serious precautions against its neighbors to the east, and its geographical advantage of rich products can be connected with the Chenla area. The Archbishop felt that it was necessary to seize the opportunity to attack Vietnam and Siam, Thailand, before other powers embark on a friendly mission. Chapter 272 Crusade against the enemies of civilization. Forget about armed missionary work. After all, Chenla is too far away from the Austrian Empire. Furthermore, due to the important geographical location of Siam, many great powers have their own interests here. If Austria wants to blatantly monopolize this place, it will inevitably cause dissatisfaction in some countries, not to mention that the UN Army, the Ming Army, and later the US military all fell into Vietnam, another cemetery of Asian powers. So France did not want to follow in their footsteps, but forcing the other party to cede territory and pay compensation and engage in dumping trade is a good idea, because even if the Austrians don't take action, the French will end up personally point. Rather than letting the latter take advantage, it's better to just take it yourself. Of course, Vietnam is not very difficult to fight, as long as it is not planned to be occupied for a long time. The Vietnam corridor is long and narrow, with terrain high in the west and low in the east. 3/4 of the territory is occupied by mountains. Among them, mountains and plateaus are distributed in the north and northwest, and the Changshan Mountains in the middle run from north to south. The plain areas are mainly concentrated on the eastern coast. The terrain here is low and flat, and the river network is dense, which is very suitable for the development of agriculture. This is also an important reason why neither the powerful Ming dynasty nor the descendants of the arrogant Genghis Khan were able to conquer Vietnam. Its long and narrow land, complex terrain, harsh climate and other unfavorable factors gave the conquerors a headache. In the end, the army's supplies were unsustainable, and they had to return without success. But there are exceptions. For example, the French discovered a trick. Since attacking from land is full of risks, then choose to attack Vietnam from the sea. In this way, you can hit its weak abdominal area and change from passive to active. Vietnam has two most economically developed and densely populated regions. One is the Red River Delta Plain in the north, and the other is the Mekong River Plain in the south. The Jialang River is connected to the Mekong River in Chenla. This created good conditions for the Austrian invasion. The enemy's navy was overwhelmed and completely unable to control the sea. Therefore, it is crucial to use the absolute advantage of its own maritime power to continuously harass its waters and carry out port raids to win Vietnam. Then, when his army was exhausted, he sent a large army down the Mekong River to the Jialang River Plain, forcing the other party to surrender and cede territory to pay compensation. It may be that the universe and the earth work together in time, or it may be that, if a person is unlucky enough to drink cold water, his teeth will become clogged. At this time, the ignorant Vietnamese captured and executed a group of French missionaries, and their monarch, Emperor Ming, unabashedly revealed his dislike of Catholicism, so this gave Austria an almost perfect start to the war. However, Vietnam's eternal emperor was already terminally ill, and was succeeded by his son Nguyen Phuc Quy, who was renamed Chao Zhi. This Emperor Chao Zhi did not have the grand plans of his father, but his ambition was as high as the sky. He even looked down upon his father's actions in his later years, thinking that it was because Ruan Fucheng became deaf and dim in his later years that he was defeated by the high barbarian natives of Zenla. As for begging for peace with the red-haired people, there is absolutely no need. As long as you work hard on your own, all red-haired and yellow-haired people will tremble under the iron hoof of David. Hoang Mao is the Vietnamese name for the British and French. Hoang Mao refers to the Austrians, although Emperor Ming had maintained a tributary relationship with the Qing dynasty before, and still called himself Vietnam in his interactions with the Manchu Qing dynasty. He had always regarded himself as the leader of the Great South in private. His biggest dream in life was to conquer the Central Plains. To this end, he stationed 150,000 troops in northern Vietnam and built countless weapons and armors. He also summoned civilians from various places to repair roads. After seeing the combat effectiveness of Huang Mao and Red Mao, Ruan Fuquan lost his dream and instead worried that foreign powers would use their maritime advantages to invade his land, point worthy of being a wise king of Vietnam. After discovering this possibility, Nguyen Phuc tried his best to nip this risk in the bud. Point on the one hand, Nguyen Phuc sent a mission composed of officials to visit France, preparing to join forces with them to fight against the British. He even made concessions on missionary matters, which he had always been sensitive to. Point on the other hand, he issued an edict to build hidden piles at the mouths of rivers in the country to reduce the risk of maritime invasion. Point at the same time, relevant officials were ordered to build forts at strategic locations and be responsible for training the navy. They even planned to evacuate residents from coastal areas to implement a sea ban. Point unfortunately, because the Western world had a very bad impression of Emperor Minh Minh and the Vietnamese, the mission was not personally received by Louis Philippe. After arriving in Paris, a simple summary is that Vietnam once received help from the French during difficult times, but instead of repaying the favor, it imposed heavy taxes on businessmen, expelled ambassadors, and hunted and killed missionaries. Notable people from all walks of life in Paris appealed to Louis Philippe not to receive these barbarians. In fact, Guizot hoped that France could establish a colony in Vietnam, but he could not go against public opinion. Point the king himself was not too concerned about matters in Southeast Asia, so the mission sent by Emperor Minh Minh could only return without success. Emperor Minh Minh's coastal defense measures not only caused widespread complaints among the people, but also affected the interests of aristocratic officials. Coupled with the new defeat at Chen La, civil unrest broke out in Vietnam for a while, which harmed the leader of the Nguyen dynasty's revival. Can't afford to be sick. Point only then did Emperor Shao Zhi massacre French missionaries. Having said that, these French people are really unlucky. They were originally hired by Paris to collect local intelligence. Because the Vietnamese had a low profile before, they were not aware of the potential dangers of this work. Point. But what they didn't expect was that they were caught together as soon as they landed and were eventually executed together. Emperor Shao Zhi also didn't expect that this was clearly an act to show off his martial virtues, but it would become an excuse for Austria to go to war with it. Point France also made special preparations for this war. The news of the murder of the French missionary had already caused an uproar in the French church, but at this time France added to the fire. Point an article titled Top 10 Hates quickly dominated the front pages of major European media. The author was the queen of a small country in Southeast Asia. Queen Chen La and me, a great hatred, invade our land and kill our people. Point the two greatest hatreds are destroying my temples and killing my monks. The translation is, burn down the church and massacre the priests. The three great hatreds are to seize my family and country and to kill my father. The former king Anzan died in a Vietnamese palace. The four great hatreds imprisoned my sisters and abandoned their bodies in the river. In order to weaken Chen La's resistance, Vietnam once imprisoned and tortured Queen An Mua's sisters to death, and then cut their bodies into pieces and threw them into the river. The five great hatreds are fostering traitorous parties and disrupting our government, establishing a puppet regime. The six major hatreds are robbery and plunder, which destroys our market, hinders free trade. The seven great hatreds are to capture people as slaves and to force good girls into prostitution, slavery, slave trade. There is nothing left to write. Point the whole of Europe was surprised that there was such a barbaric and arrogant country in the world. No one had any doubts about the justice of this war when the Austrian Empire announced that it would help Chen La conquer Vietnam, the enemy of civilization. There was only a sound of praise. Point protecting Christians, liberating slaves, free trade, spreading civilization. Any one of them can be the reason for this war, and it is a good reason. Chapter 273 The First Austro-Vietnamese War. When the Austrian Empire's letter of war and the so-called 10 hatreds were delivered to his palace, Emperor Minh Minh knew the catastrophe his son had caused. He passed away in a moment of rage. Point of course, this was not included in Franz's calculations, and the life and death of the former emperor no longer mattered, because it did not matter to the Austrian Empire who the opponent was, or even to Vietnam. Point at this time, Emperor Shao Zhi did not feel sad because of his father's death. Instead, he felt a trace of sadness in his heart. It's a pity that the destined emperor is afraid of yellow-haired ghosts. Nguyen Phuc Chun's confidence was not unfounded. At this time, Vietnam had 150,000 elite soldiers, and those who participated in the invasion of Chen Lo were just some temporarily recruited bandits and landless farmers, not regular troops at all. At the same time, the Vietnamese navy had a total of 300 large and small warships. Although they were not comparable to the huge bird ships of the Qing dynasty, they did have huge flying boats. This large-scale fortune ship is more than 36 meters long, about 7 meters wide, has 24 cabins, and can carry 1,500 stones. Each ship is equipped with more than 30 sailors and boatmen and 80 sailors. It is equipped with double masts, double rudders and double anchors. It is a relic of shipbuilding technology of the Ming dynasty, but it is actually not up to the level of the Ming dynasty. His naval warfare rules were adapted from Shillang's Xiangxing formation. The fourth configuration of this formation is like the diagonal flight of wild geese. The key point is to give full play to the power of the shooting arms. If the firepower is dominant, it will naturally be unfavorable. A modified version of the wild goose formation. The name seems to have been given by the old man Shi Quan. The information was obtained from martial arts novels. It is just to make you laugh. While Franz was building momentum in Europe, the war started in Asia. After all, he was not sure whether other powers would also get involved. The Austrian Empire's expeditionary force did receive a lot of donations and volunteers. Because the momentum was too large, Friedrich had to take charge personally. Of course, he himself really hopes to fight this war. After all, he has not fought with Asian countries yet, and he also wants to test the power of new weapons. The propellant of rockets is denser and the shape is more aerodynamic. After the war began, as soon as the 100,000 Vietnamese army arrived in Hue, from the north to the center, from Hanoi, its leading general received news that the Southern Navy had been defeated by Kampong Som, the South China Sea, and the North Sea Point. Whether it was the shuttle boats that the Vietnamese had high hopes for before the war, or those rice boats, which are a bunch of sampan boats, basically driven by oars, they were all vulnerable to the steam battleships of the Austrian fleet. With only one third-level battleship and 7 frigates, all these 14th century antiques were sent to the bottom of the sea. Immediately afterwards, the transport ship carrying the Skitterii composed of Chen La people landed at Haiphong, an important port in Vietnam, and approached the Vietnamese capital. This move was beyond Emperor Shao Zhi's expectation. He originally thought that with 50,000 elite soldiers and local troops, there would be no problem in defending the capital. But who would have thought that in the first battle outside Haiphong port, more than 20,000 of his own troops would be defeated. Although the actual number of casualties was only a few hundred. Due to the huge firepower gap and the fact that the leading Vietnamese general was killed on the spot, the remaining terrified officers and soldiers fled, as if they were infected by the plague. The news reached Hue, and Emperor Shao Zhi sent a flying pigeon to deliver the message overnight, calling for reinforcement from the army. Li Shan, who was leading the expedition, had to lead his troops towards Hanoi, but before he could reach the battlefield, another battle broke out in the Jialongjiang plain in the south. The local defenders were attacked from the east and west, and suffered heavy losses. Emperor Shaozi sent Li Shan on an expedition again. After receiving the order in a hurry, the latter wanted to supply supplies in Hue, but news came that the outskirts of Hue city had been captured by the enemy. At this time, the general didn't care so much. He intended to fight to the death with the yellow-haired ghost and the accomplices of the tall barbarians here. But this dream came to nothing again. When the Vietnamese army arrived in Hue city, the enemy had already disappeared. What's worse is that the ordnance and supplies in the city's storage warehouses were either snatched away or distributed to local civilians. This move can be described as murderous and heartbreaking. Just when the Vietnamese were trying to save the unfavorable war situation, the bad news that Hanoi and the Jialongjiang plain were in emergency at the same time came again. At this time, Emperor Shao Zhi, who was in the Hue Palace, finally understood his father's good intentions, because when the Skitterii attacked the outer city, he had a certain understanding of the enemy's strength. Originally, the other party could easily capture the palace and end the war quickly, but they did not do so. Obviously, the real purpose of Huang Mao, who controls the Qinla area, is not only to show off his force, but also to make his own army exhausted. Soon after hearing the report of the loss of the Jiangling clan, Emperor Shaozi decided to surrender. Representatives of both sides negotiated on an Austrian warship in the Gulf of Tonkin. The agreement was drawn up by Franz early on, and the conditions were that Vietnam was required to cede the Jiangling plain area and pay an indemnity of 3 million taels of silver. However, Emperor Shaozi refused, and he decided to use force to retake the Jiangling plain. Austria soon once again sent a land and sea attack to the city of Hue. The Royal Forest Army guarding the Imperial city is already considered one of the most elite troops in Vietnam. But the soldiers carrying old-fashioned iron armor and muskets were no match for the Austrian Marine Corps. What's more, this time Austria has doubled the number of warships equipped for this ocean-going battle, and the person in charge is Archduke Friedrich himself. This arrogant genius boy did not care about the value of cultural relics. He directly ordered the Vietnamese capital to be rocket cleansed. Immediately afterwards, 20,000 rounds of new rodless spin rockets roared across the earth, directly burning the city of Hue, which was mainly made of wood, to the ground. Even the palace in the city was affected, with nearly half of the ancillary buildings destroyed. Of course, as the foundation of the Nguyen dynasty, the resistance here is quite fierce. When the Austrian Marines entered the city of Hue, which was almost in ruins, there were still Vietnamese wearing poor armor and holding short daggers in their hands, shouting and rushing out, but this was of no avail. But at this time, they were no longer the invincible army that swept through Shaanxi, the name of the place in Vietnam, and intended to conquer the Central Plains. The charge of these men became meaningless in the face of the three-part volley and fierce firepower superiority of the Austrian army. Even if our own side occasionally suffers casualties, they will be borne by the Sciterii in front. Friedrich didn't know how the church and France tamed this group of servants, but since there was cannon fodder, there was no reason for him to risk his elite troops. Soon, Friedrich and his men arrived at the royal palace in Hue, surrounded by soldiers. Half of this majestic palace has been reduced to ruins, but its former glory can still be vaguely seen. There were several Vietnamese standing at the palace gate with their heads raised and squinting. Their expression seemed to accuse Friedrich of his treason, but it didn't take long for these proud heads to leave their master's body. Friedrich didn't want to waste time. Since these people didn't want to talk, let's change the group. Chapter 274 Treaty of Hue. Friedrich didn't want to waste time with these people, so the translator in the Sciterii immediately shouted a few times outside the palace gate. Soon after, an old eunuch came out and spoke in very awkward French. "My Majesty, the Emperor of the Southern Empire, invites you." Friedrich sat on a sedan he had just captured and fired a shot at the old eunuch's feet, scaring the old eunuch so much that he wet his pants. "Don't speak French to me. I failed in French. Let the people inside come out to talk immediately, otherwise I will burn this place down and find someone willing to talk." After a while, Emperor Shaozi of Vietnam, accompanied by a group of concubines, came to the square in front of the palace tremblingly. Friedrich looked at the shivering man hiding among the women in front of him and immediately lost interest in playing around. He took out the translated version of the treaty text that he had prepared and handed it to him. 1. Cede the Jiangling plain to the Austrian Empire, plus an indemnity of 3 million taels of silver. 2. Return the remains of all Western missionaries over the years and make a public apology in writing. 3. A pension of 300,000 taels of silver must be paid to relatives or the church. The above terms were within Emperor Shaozi's expectations. Although the land cessation and compensation made him feel pain, the ruined dynasty was like a live fish waiting to be slaughtered on the cutting board, and had no qualifications to bargain. As a feudal emperor, Nguyen Phuc Khang did not have the so-called feelings of family and country. As a believer in existential philosophy, his principle in life is everything is for existence, and existence is everything. All other people with land and money are just passing smoke, and are not as important as living. Therefore, all behaviors that humiliate the country by losing power are just a waste of money. to eliminate disasters in the eyes of Emperor Shaoxi. However, there were two clauses in the treaty at this time that he found difficult to accept, which were to prohibit the slave trade and free all slaves. Since the Tang dynasty, Vietnam had been Asia's largest slave trader and had been profiting from it. For example, the famous Kun Lun Nu, Uncle Black, comes from Saigon market. The legendary bodhisattva is most likely alluding to Vietnamese girls and Persian fairies, and these two types of people are also believed to be from the Saigon market. However, with the maritime ban of the Ming dynasty, the seclusion of the country by the Qing dynasty, and the subsequent gunboat diplomacy of Westerners, Saigon is no longer an important node in East-West trade. Only natives from Indochina were left in the slave market in Vietnam. The Vietnamese have always relied on capturing Laos and Chen La people to expand their slave army. In addition, some people who cannot repay their debts and criminals are treated as slaves. So once the slave trade is banned, it will undoubtedly touch the cake of many people. At the same time, if all the slaves were released, it would be an astronomical figure, which would definitely arouse dissatisfaction across Vietnam. Why? Are you still hesitating? If you don't sign, I will burn down your wooden house. Friedrich saw the other party's hesitation in his eyes, so he began to launch an intimidation offensive. After all, according to what Franz said, some people just won't cry until they see the coffin. Ruin Fuxi you. I really wanted to know about this matter as soon as possible. But as a monarch, he is not the only ruler of this country. If the Jade Seal is really hastily stamped like this, not only will the dignitaries and landowners in Vietnam be offended by him, but the reputation of this defeat will be ruined, and the Nguyen dynasty will end in a humiliating way. If you sign, you will be dead, but if you don't sign, there will be a glimmer of hope. Thinking of this, Ruin Fuck immediately stood up, straightened his clothes, and stepped forward with the support of his favorite concubine. Said, "Our country, the Yaxing of Deu, has existed since ancient times. The laws of our ancestors cannot be changed. As an orthodox member of the Ruin family, I cannot kill or behead you for such a treasonous thing. Please do as you please." Friedrich really wanted to shoot the trembling old bastard in front of him, but his reason stopped him. Because once this nominal legal ruler is lost, this place will turn into a quagmire that swallows everything. He recalled a conversation he had with Franz not long ago about trying to avoid security wars. The benefits of a colony depended on its output and maintenance costs. If the cost is too high, it will be a burden for the country, and excessive costs will lead to intensification of domestic politics at the same time. If too much power is invested in a colony, it is very likely to fall into an anxious situation, where the colony cannot be lost, and it is easy to be instigated and bewitched by foreign forces, to form a trend of separation from the mother country. To be honest, no matter how big or small a country is, strong or weak, colonization is never a simple process different from simply plundering or plundering. If you want to maintain blood transfusion from the colonies to your country for a long time, you must first carry out long-term investment and development. In other words, the necessary prerequisite for obtaining higher returns is stable and uninterrupted investment of money, materials and manpower, and this means that you also need to take huge risks. Natural disasters, wars, and even simple poor management may lead to losses. After all, today's colonies not only cannot bring economic benefits to the mother country, but also need to draw blood from the mother country. If you are not careful, it may become a catalyst that intensifies conflicts among political groups. Franz didn't want all the Austrian expeditionary forces to suffer from PTSD, the kind that would scare them to the point of peeing when they heard Farionet's Son. Farionet's Son, the famous Vietnam War song, often appears in various film and television works about the Vietnam War. It first appeared in Forrest Gump when writing to his uncle, a naval genius. He suggested that the Vietnamese hand over 20,000 slaves. The number of 20,000 was quite shocking to European countries, but for Vietnam, a country with millions of slaves, but it's a drop in the bucket. Therefore, Emperor Shaoxi finally won his bet. The Austrian general in a gorgeous navy blue dress put down his gun and took out a revised and more relaxed treaty from his arms, and the Vietnamese monarch may not have been driven by the desire to kill people with a borrowed knife. After all, 20,000 slaves are not as simple as being insignificant to some families that may endanger his rule. After completing the relevant procedures, Friedrich led the Austrian army to leave Hue, because he was not sure whether the other party would return to support Point. If the Vietnamese army of 100,000 soldiers really desperately wanted to keep him, this star of the Imperial Navy would probably perish Point. In fact, Friedrich was overly worried at this time. On the other side of the Gia River plain, the Vietnamese army had an unfavorable start. They were attacked by the Chen La people who had been prepared for half-crossing, and lost thousands of troops, forcing the Coach Li Shan to choose to confront each other across the river. However, on the other side of the river, Ambrosius, the coach of the Chen La army, was not happy at all. The main equipment of the Chen La army in his hand is still antiques such as broadswords, spears, bows, and arrows that should be displayed in museums. The aim of the artillerymen and gunners under his command completely depends on faith and luck. 20 cannons and 5,000 guns. If they were replaced by the troops of Austria and other European powers, they would probably have defeated the opponent. Who would have thought that the advantageous attack only caused thousands of casualties to the opponent, and a considerable number of them were drowned by the water when crossing the river. Fortunately, however, the Vietnamese monarch's edict demanding surrender was soon passed to the hands of the frontline General Li Shan. Unable to save himself, he gave up the idea of fighting to the death, and led his men to surrender. At this point, the First Austria-Vietnam War ended, and the Vietnamese ceded the Gia River plain to Austria, plus an indemnity of 3 million taels of silver. Another strategic value of this war is to obtain the future mining rights of a large amount of excellent quality anthracite coal owned by Vietnam. This is an extremely scarce strategic resource, and it is also the only occupiable anthracite producer in the entire coastal region of Asia and Africa. In the age of steam, coal was the blood of battleships. High quality anthracite can not only provide it with stable and powerful power, but also facilitate hiding targets at sea. In order to win a naval battle, the Japanese combined fleet even spent a lot of money to purchase anthracite coal from the United Kingdom. The inferior coal even indirectly led to the destruction of the Russian Baltic Fleet. Although the Austrian Empire has a lot of coal reserves, they are mainly bituminous coal and lignite, and artificial anthracite coal seems to be not worth the gain in this era. At the same time, anthracite is also an important chemical raw material, and its main use is in the fertilizer industry. Nitrogen fertilizer, synthetic ammonia. In addition, anthracite also plays an important role in industries such as ceramics and forging, and it is the best choice for blast furnace injection. Chapter 275 Scientists. In Vienna, a lavishly decorated temporary conference room of the Royal Austrian Scientific Society was filled with guests. The monthly scientific symposium was being held here, and this was the 24th time that Avogadro borrowed the scientists' room stage to present the results of his research. He had been rejected in the previous 23 meetings. If it were an ordinary person, he would have left the meeting, because he could not bear the cold looks and ridicule. The person who had a negative attitude towards his views was not an ordinary person, but the absolute authority in the European chemical community at this time, the British Sultan. But this outspoken man from Apennine was not deterred, especially when he believed that the truth was in his own hands. Avogadro had never been a submissive person who dared not speak out against authority. I remember that when he was still a young boy, he dared to stand up and openly challenge the theory of king of mathematics Gauss, and used his own method to argue to silence the other party. At that time, Gauss had supreme authority in the mathematical community, and was hailed by all his colleagues as the man closest to the truth. This person did make an unparalleled contribution to the development of mathematics. However, even such a person is not perfect, and will make mistakes. Scientific laws exist only in mathematics, and chemistry is not among the exact sciences. Many people wanted to refute Gauss's assertion, but they were afraid of humiliating themselves when facing the unprecedented genius at this time. Avogadro, a physics student who was halfway through becoming a monk, boldly put forward a different view from Gauss. He believed that mathematics is the king of natural sciences, but without other natural sciences, mathematics will lose its true value. Gauss was already successful at that time, while Avogadro was a tax collector in the countryside of Turin a year ago. What's more, the latter majored in physics, and chemistry was just his side job. He was a typical physicist who didn't understand chemistry. Scholars are not good tax collectors. Gauss did not have a good temper and humiliated Avogadro on the spot. Chemistry is just a maid to mathematics. The translations are different, but the meaning is the same. Avogadro did not get angry when faced with the humiliation, but responded with an experiment. He put 2 liters of hydrogen into 1 liter of oxygen, and burned it in front of Gauss, and obtained 2 liters of water vapor. Please. See, in chemistry, I can do 2 + 1 = 2. Can you do it in mathematics? Although Avogadro's reply was wonderful, it only earned himself the title of Daredevil. Later, he unintentionally offended Dalton, who continued to suppress him. He even lost his position as a professor at the University of Turin, and had to rely on family support for a time. Historically, Avogadro never pursued fame and status throughout his life, but quietly immersed himself in scientific research work, and proposed the molecular hypothesis in 1811, which should have advanced people's understanding of the structure of matter a big step forward. Unfortunately, Avogadro's outstanding insights were not recognized by the chemical community for a long time. Instead, they were opposed by many scientists, and were left out in the cold for nearly half a century. But things are different now. With the full support and funding of Franz, a materialist who respects science and knowledge, this neglected scientific giant has gained the opportunity to communicate and discuss with the best chemists in Central Europe. A valuable opportunity. This allowed him to greatly improve his own theory, and at the same time, it also allowed those geniuses who look at people with their nostrils upward to re-examine themselves. This allowed him to greatly improve his own theory, and also allowed geniuses who had once dismissed Avogadro's theory to re-examine this theory. The chemical experts present at this time are Fuchs, a Bavarian mineralogist, was one of the founders of analytical chemistry. Debelina, a self-taught genius, created an inflatable gas lighting lamp composed of a hydrogenation device, which greatly influenced the public lighting projects at that time, and in later generations. He was also an expert in testing atomic weights. However, due to lack of money and power, he did not obtain the patent for the technology he invented, and his life was very difficult. Fischer, a Bohemian, was recorded in the history of inorganic chemistry with his discovery of Fischer's salt. He was also one of the pioneers of the Voda battery, and established a method for detecting poisoning. Voltaic cells, early batteries, had poor practicality. Gemelin, also known as Gemelin, a Hanoverian and cyanide expert, wrote many introductory books on chemistry, and trained a number of chemists who will be famous for later generations. Mitscherlich, a native of Oldenburg and an expert in crystal chemistry, synthesized nitrobenzene and made outstanding contributions in fuel, gunpowder, and sucrose fermentation. Freeman Runge, a native of Hamburg, extracted phenol, nitrogen and other substances from coal tar and developed paper chromatography. He was also a pioneer in paper chromatography measurement technology and a master of dye chemistry. Schunbein, a native of Baden, is a typical example of an all-rounder who knows everything from astronomy to geography. His most important discoveries are auto-oxidation, induced reactions, collodion, nitrocellulose, taken off from woohoo, electrochemistry, and passivation iron. Although he devoted his life to treating diseases and saving people, most of his inventions later became weapons for killing people. Wheeler, a student of Gmelin, and one of the greatest chemists in human history. Liebig, the founder of agricultural chemistry, synthesized Urey with Wheeler. The last two are giants. If they were to be discussed in detail, one chapter would not be enough, so I won't write them down. etc. These people who have left a profound mark on the history of human chemistry are by no means mediocre. The main reason why Avogadro's theory has not been welcomed is not the pressure of authority. The main reason is that the natural science at that time could not distinguish between molecules and atoms at the same time. Due to the dissociation phenomenon of some molecules, it is difficult for Avogadro's hypothesis to give a convincing empirical explanation. However, because a certain butterfly flapped its wings a few times, some minor obstacles were solved, so they naturally had no reason to continue to hold a negative attitude towards this theory point at the same time. These people also know that the establishment of this theory will bring about earth-shaking changes to the entire chemical world. After 30 years of hard work, Avogadro finally got his wish, but he didn't have much time to celebrate, because there are still people who plan to show and demonstrate their new results later. In fact, Avogadro was very lucky at this time, because his results were recognized 20 years earlier. Historically, he did not even survive to wait for that day. With Franz's encouragement, new theories, new inventions, and new methods were proposed one after another. These exciting things will eventually change the entire world. For scientists at the Royal Society, this constant iteration of knowledge is also refreshing. Of course, there are also monsters that give scientists headaches, such as the steam-powered computer developed by Babbage and Ada. Previously, the two people advanced the accuracy of the difference engine to 7 decimal places and simplified the use method to calculate the accuracy up to 21 digits. This saves many physicists and chemists from having to spend a lot of time and energy on repeated calculations. In fact, thanks to the high-power hydraulic press developed by Franz's group of madmen, the Austrian Empire has precision parts manufacturing capabilities that far exceed this era. At this time, a 20-bit differential engine that took 3 months to build and cost up to £20,000 only cost 1 week and 3,000 florins in Vienna. The latest 21-bit differential engine costs only 10,000 florins, and the occurrence rate of defective products is low. As a result, Babbage and Ada swelled, in every sense of the word, because they often tasted students' works and even packed them back to the laboratory. Their weight and confidence increased rapidly. Babbage planned to develop a new, time-unique analytical engine. End of this chapter. Thank you very much for reaching the end. Don't forget to like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription, or donation encourages us to continue. Thanks to everyone. See you in the next video.